Picture yourself far from your own room, far from the weight of today. Imagine a quiet building of stone and glass, where the air feels cooler than the street outside, and time seems to slow simply because so much of it is stored there. In places like this, history does not shout. It waits. It rests in clay and dust, in careful labels, in objects small enough to miss if your mind is still loud. So let the present loosen its grip. Let your breathing settle into something easy. Tonight, you do not have to solve anything. You only have to drift through an old question, the kind that has followed humanity like a shadow across millennia. The museum corridor is long and softly lit, and the sound of your steps becomes the only rhythm you need to follow. A gentle echo on polished floors as glass cases hold broken bowls, bronze blades, and tablets covered in marks that look like tiny bird tracks pressed into mud. If you feel drawn to journeys like this, you can subscribe in the quietest way, as if leaving a small lantern at the edge of the path, not as a demand, only as a promise that you might return here again when the world grows too loud. In the Mesopotamian gallery, tucked among larger monuments, there is a humble object that refuses to behave like a humble thing. It is a clay prism, small enough to fit in your hands, its sides crowded with cuneiform signs that were once wet impressions made by a reed stylus. The surface is not smooth. It is the texture of earth that has been handled, dried, fired, carried, lost, and found again. Most visitors pass it as they pass 1,000 other artifacts, trusting the glass to keep it safely distant and trusting the label to summarize whatever matters. But when you stand close, you begin to feel that this prism is not simply recording names. It is recording time itself, and time in its oldest, strangest mood. It lists kings, not a handful, but a procession. And then it does something that makes the modern mind hesitate, as if a stair has been built with one step far too high. It gives reign lengths that stretch into thousands, then tens of thousands, and it does so with a calm precision, like a clerk noting ordinary expenses. A ruler endures for an age, another for an age longer still. The numbers keep arriving, not as poetry, but as accounting. Then comes a sentence that sounds almost casual, and precisely because it sounds casual, it lands like a stone in deep water. A flood swept over. Everything turned. And afterward, kingship returned again, as if it had been absent only briefly, as if it had been lifted away and then lowered back into the world. The list continues, but the world it describes feels changed. The reigns shorten. They are still impossibly long at first, yet the direction is unmistakable. What once spanned cosmic lengths begins to shrink, generation by generation, until the numbers resemble the rhythms we recognize, the scale of human lives, the scale of histories we can cross-reference, excavate, and argue about with confidence. It reads like a memory of decline, not sudden and dramatic, but gradual, like a candle burning down in a room where nobody is watching. And as you stand there, you might notice that the unsettling part is not whether the numbers are literal. The unsettling part is that the text preserves a pattern. Before the flood, there is a vastness. After the flood, there is a narrowing. Something is lost. Not only land beneath water, but duration itself, as if the human story used to have a longer breath. Tonight, we will not rush to label this as myth or mistake. We will let it remain what it is, a quiet artifact that refuses to fit comfortably inside the story we were taught. We will treat it as a doorway, not a door into certainty, but a door into possibility. What if the list is not telling us that a single man lived for 30,000 years, but that a world once moved through longer chapters than we can easily imagine? And then, almost without warning, you begin to notice the same shape elsewhere. In distant traditions, in places with different gods and different calendars, the same curve appears. Long ages, a catastrophe, shorter ages, a diminishing. If stories from far apart lands echo the same rhythm, is that coincidence? Or is it a kind of inheritance, a memory carried forward until it sounds like legend? You do not have to decide. You only have to listen. The museum hum fades. The glass becomes less important than the idea inside it. The clay prism sits perfectly still, yet it seems to ask a question that follows you out of the gallery and into the dark of your own room, where time feels both ordinary and impossibly fragile. If this is not the first chapter, then what chapter are we living in now? If this is not the first chapter, then the question is not only what came before, but why so many beginnings seem to arrive with the feeling of aftermath, as if civilization wakes up on a shore where the tide has already gone out. To understand why a Sumerian list of kings could feel like a record of more than kings, you have to step into the Sumerian relationship with order itself. Their cities rose between two rivers that could be generous and violent in the same season. Irrigation turned mud into grain. Flooding could turn grain into silence. The border between stability and collapse was not theoretical for them. It was seasonal. It was personal. And because their lives depended on cycles, their minds learned to think in cycles. When a text says that kingship descended from heaven, it is easy for a modern ear to file it under metaphor. But in the ancient world, authority was not merely political. It was cosmic. A king did not simply govern land. He mirrored the structure of the sky. He stood at the intersection of human labor and divine decree. In that view, kingship descending from heaven is not a poetic flourish. It is a statement about the origin of legitimacy, about the idea that order is borrowed from something larger than the city walls, and now the numbers on the prism begin to behave differently. If you take them as literal lifespans, they become absurd. If you take them as bookkeeping, they become bizarre. But if you take them as something like compressed eras, the way later cultures might speak of an age as if it were a person, the list begins to shift into a different kind of sense. Think of how easily we, even now, fold centuries into a single name. We speak of an era as though it had hands and a voice. We speak of a dynasty as though it were a single organism, rising, peaking, failing. We do it because the mind needs shapes. The mind needs symbols to hold time without drowning in it. A list of kings can be a list of rulers, yes, but it can also be a skeleton for something larger, a framework that carries memory when memory is too large to carry directly. There is another hint tucked inside the numbers themselves. The Sumerians counted in a system that favored 60, a way of measuring that still haunts our clocks and circles. Certain large units appear again and again in their mathematics, as if the reign lengths were chosen not only to impress, but to resonate, to align with a sacred arithmetic, a harmony of counting that felt like truth. This does not prove anything on its own. Sacred numbers can be symbolism. They can be ritual. They can be a game of patterns played by scribes who loved structure. But symbolism has its own kind of honesty. A culture does not choose its sacred numbers at random. It chooses what feels like the architecture of reality. And then you remember the shape again, the shrinking. The list does not give you chaos. It gives you a tapering. It tells you that whatever was immense became less immense, step by step, until it resembles the world the scribes knew. That is what makes it feel like something more than invention. In invention, exaggeration tends to swell without restraint. Here, exaggeration, if it is exaggeration, behaves like a measured decline, like a story of loss. Now imagine not the museum, but a scribal room in an ancient city. The walls are clay brick. The light is slanted and dusty. An apprentice kneels beside a low bench, smoothing a tablet, waiting for permission to write. The master recites lists. Not because lists are thrilling, but because lists are memory. In a world where paper does not exist, where most people never learn to read, repetition is a vault. The apprentice learns the names, the cities, the rains. He learns that there was a time before a flood. He learns that after the flood, the world resumes, yet diminished. And he learns something else, something quieter and more practical. That whatever happened before, it left enough of an impression that it must be preserved, because preservation is how a civilization speaks across its own deaths. As you listen, the possibility grows warmer and stranger. Perhaps the prism is not a record of impossible men. Perhaps it is a record of impossible time, or rather, time made possible again and again by rebuilding, by returning, by beginning with scraps. If that is true, then the Sumerian story is not unique. It is the first written echo of a much older rhythm, one that other cultures would sing in their own languages, with their own gods, their own floods, and their own ages of gold that always seem to be behind us. If the ages of gold always seem to be behind us, then we should follow the echo outward, away from Mesopotamia, away from the rivers and the clay, and listen for the same rhythm in places that never learned cuneiform and never prayed to Sumerian names. In India, time is often imagined not as a straight road but as a wheel, a slow turning with spokes too large to count in a single life. The great ages there are not merely historical periods. They are moral climates, atmospheres of being. The story says that the world moves from a luminous age toward darker ones, and that with each turning, something diminishes. Lifespans shorten, virtue thins, confusion grows. And then, at the far end of decline, there is a reset, not necessarily a punishment, but a clearing, a return to beginning. In Greece, a different voice tells a similar tale. There is an age when humans live with ease, closer to the divine. Then there are later ages marked by struggle, by iron, by labor, by exhaustion. The poet does not place his hope in the future. He looks backward with longing, as if the past held a lighter world, and the present is the heavy remainder. Far north, other traditions imagine cycles of destruction and rebirth, not only for humans, but for gods themselves. The world burns, the world floods, the world is remade. The details differ, but the structure remains. There is a before that feels brighter, and there is an after that feels smaller, and between them is an event that the mind cannot fully domesticate. Across the ocean, in the Americas, the story repeats in yet another register. Worlds are created and destroyed in sequence. A sun rises, a sun fails, a people live, a people vanish. The present becomes only one iteration, not the climax of history, but a temporary clearing between catastrophes. When you lay these traditions side by side, you are not forced to believe they are all literal, but you are invited to notice that they rhyme. And the mind naturally asks why. Why would cultures separated by oceans and millennia share a pattern that includes long ages, catastrophe, and decline? One answer is simple and human. Floods happen. Fires happen. Earthquakes happen. People mourn what they lose and imagine a time when things were better. Every generation believes the world has fallen from a purer state. In this view, the myths are mirrors reflecting the same psychology, not the same event. But there is another possibility that sits beside that one, quieter and harder to dismiss completely. Human beings have been anatomically modern for a very long time. We have carried our intelligence through tens of thousands of years. Yet the portion of the past that modern archaeology can map with confidence is narrow compared to that span, and much of what humans built may have been built in places that the sea now covers. At the end of the last ice age, oceans rose, shorelines moved, river valleys transformed. Whole landscapes that once might have held settlements became submerged, buried under sediment, hidden beneath water that blurs and breaks stone and swallows wood without leaving a neat outline for later discovery. If people lived on coasts, and people almost always do, then the sea has taken a great archive from us. From that perspective, a flood myth is not a fantasy of a single rainy season. It is a cultural memory of a world-changing shape. It is the remembrance of land becoming ocean, of familiar routes vanishing, of cemeteries and homes slipping beneath water that does not return what it takes. Passed down for generations, such memory would lose its precise geography, its slow timeline, its mundane mechanisms. It would become a story. Not because it is false, but because story is how trauma survives. And once you allow that, the prism on its pedestal looks different. The Sumerian floodline becomes less like a dramatic invention and more like a marker, a boundary between worlds. Before, there is vast time. After, there is rebuilding. The same shape appears in other traditions because other communities experienced their own boundaries, their own endings, their own forced migrations into a changed world. Still, even this does not require multiple advanced civilizations. It only requires change and memory, and enough time for memory to wear the clothing of myth. But there are places on Earth that complicate the neat ladder we prefer, places that appear earlier than expected, built with a coordination that seems to arrive too soon. Some ancient sites suggest large gatherings, careful stonework, and planning that does not fit the simplest picture of scattered bands slowly stumbling toward complexity. Whether those sites imply hidden civilizations or simply hidden capacities within peoples we mislabeled as simple is still debated. Yet debate itself is part of the point. The past is not a fixed mural. It is a field under excavation, and the more we dig, the more we learn that certainty is often a temporary feeling. So the question returns, as softly as your own breath. If the world has ended for human communities before, and if the sea has erased chapters we can no longer read, then the idea of repeated cycles stops sounding like fantasy and starts sounding like a lens. Not a claim, but a way of looking. And once you look through that lens, the notion of being a later civilization, not the first, begins to settle into the mind like sediment in water, slow and inevitable. It does not demand belief. It only asks you to consider what it would mean to inherit a world that has already forgotten itself before, and may do so again. To inherit a world that has forgotten itself is to live inside an unfinished sentence, one that began long before our calendars and may continue long after them. And when you hold that thought gently, without forcing it into certainty, the old stories begin to feel less like entertainment and more like a kind of slow survival. Imagine the moment after a catastrophe, not the dramatic instant itself, but the quiet weeks that follow, when the water has pulled back and left a skin of silt on everything it touched. The air smells different. Familiar paths are gone. A field that once fed a village is now a shallow lake. What remains of a house is a corner of wall and a scatter of broken pottery that looks to grieving eyes like the bones of an ordinary life. In such a time, people do not argue about timelines. They do not debate symbolism. They count who is missing. They listen for children who did not make it. They look for elders who carried the names of plants, the seasons of fish, the hidden bends in rivers, the stories that explain where to find stone that cuts cleanly. And when those elders are gone, something more than bodies has been taken. A library has been drowned. This is the soft terror inside all flood myths. Not simply that water rises, but that memory sinks. Knowledge that took generations to learn can vanish in a single season. The best routes through a marsh, the safest time to plant, the proper way to store grain so it does not rot, the song that keeps the rhythm of work. the subtle rules of cooperation that allow a village to behave like a single organism. You can rebuild walls, but rebuilding the invisible architecture of culture takes longer. It takes time that survivors rarely feel they have. And yet survivors do rebuild. They always do. They gather on higher ground, where the night wind is colder and the sky feels wider. They make new fires. They salvage what they can. They trade stories with strangers who have lost different things. They create a new normal with whatever fragments the disaster allowed them to carry. Now imagine those fragments traveling forward for centuries. A child grows old hearing that there was a time before the waters when the land stretched farther and the world made more sense. Another child grows old hearing that the ancestors lived longer, that the old ones knew more, that the first days were brighter. The details blur, but the structure remains. There was a before. There was a breaking. There is an after, and the after feels diminished. This is how a catastrophe becomes an age marker. Not because anyone is trying to deceive, but because the mind naturally organizes time around trauma. There are years you cannot measure precisely, but you remember exactly where you were when the world shifted. Multiply that by generations, and you get a tradition that anchors itself to the flood, the fire, the darkness, the great shaking. These events become the hinges of history, the joints where the past bends and changes direction. When you return to the Sumerian prism with this in mind, you can feel why a scribe might preserve impossible numbers. A society that has experienced a rupture might cling to precision as a kind of prayer. If the past was taken, then at least its outline must remain. At least the names must remain. At least the order of things must remain. To copy the list is to refuse total erasure. But there is still a deeper, stranger layer to consider. The king list does not only speak of a flood, it speaks of kingship itself as something that arrives from above, something that can be withdrawn and returned. That idea carries an implication the modern mind often skips. It suggests that human order is not guaranteed. It can be granted. It can be lost. And when it is lost, what returns may not be identical to what existed before. This is where speculation begins to breathe in the darkness. If knowledge can vanish, then knowledge can also reappear in unexpected ways. A technique remembered in a song, a pattern carved into a stone because words were not safe, a calendar preserved as ritual because the explanation was forgotten, a blueprint repeated in temple after temple because nobody dared to alter what seemed sacred. Over time, such fragments can look like mysteries. They can look like the fingerprints of a civilization we never knew. Yet even here, you do not need to leap to grand conclusions. The past is capable of being both ordinary and astonishing. Humans do not require lost super-empires to be ingenious. They only require time, cooperation, and the steady pressure of necessity. What the cyclical lens offers is not a single answer. It offers a different feeling about history. It suggests that progress is not a staircase, but a tide, rising and falling, carrying shells from older shores. And if history is a tide, then the question that follows is almost unavoidable. Where are we now in that motion? Are we climbing toward a peak, believing it will last? Or are we already living in a world that future survivors will describe as the time before the waters, the time before the fire, the time when everything seemed permanent? Let that question rest without urgency. Let it sit beside your breathing like a small, steady lamp. Because the purpose of tonight is not to frighten you. It is to widen the time around you until your own worries feel lighter. The clay prism remains in its case, silent and patient, as if it has always known that civilizations come and go, and that the ones who listen most closely are often the ones who are learning how to remember. To remember is not the same as to preserve, and this distinction becomes clearer the longer you sit with the idea of cycles. Memory can survive in fragments, in feelings, in shapes that no longer carry their original explanation. Preservation, on the other hand, demands continuity, institutions, stability. It demands that the world not end too often. When the Sumerians stacked temple upon temple at the same sacred spot, rebuilding again and again after floods and collapses, they were not simply being practical. They were insisting on alignment, the same orientation, the same geometry, the same place where heaven and earth were believed to touch. Even when materials changed, even when names changed, the pattern remained. It is difficult not to sense a quiet fear beneath that insistence, a fear that if the pattern were broken, something essential would be lost forever. Across ancient landscapes, this behavior repeats. Foundations are laid directly atop older foundations. Sacred centers migrate upward rather than outward. It is as if each generation felt itself standing on the shoulders of something half-remembered, something that could not be fully explained, but could not be abandoned either. The ground itself becomes a manuscript, layers of meaning pressed into earth the way words are pressed into clay. And beneath some of those layers, archaeologists occasionally find something unsettling, a clean band of sediment, river silt where there should be hearths and floors, a geological pause that speaks of water moving with enough force to erase and flatten. Above it, a new beginning. Below it, traces of a life that ended without ceremony. These layers do not appear everywhere. Disasters are rarely uniform, but they appear often enough, across enough sites, to suggest that collapse was not a single mythic moment, but a recurring reality. Still, collapse alone does not create advanced civilizations. It only erases them. So the deeper question remains: what level of complexity could have existed before the layers we can confidently date? How far back does organized life extend, not merely in biological terms, but in social ones? And how fragile is the evidence we rely on to answer that question? Stone survives. Fired clay survives. Metal sometimes survives. But wood does not. Fiber does not. Knowledge stored in memory does not. A civilization built largely from organic materials, adapted to a different climate using techniques suited to its environment, could leave almost nothing recognizable after enough time and water have passed. Its absence would look like simplicity to those who came later. This is why the idea of a linear march from primitive to advanced is comforting. It gives the present a sense of destiny. It flatters us. But comfort is not evidence. The archaeological record is not a complete book. It is a handful of pages rescued from a fire. We infer the rest because we must, not because it is fully known. When ancient texts insist that something existed before the beginning we recognize, they are not necessarily contradicting archaeology. They may be pointing to a blind spot, not a conspiracy, a limitation. A reminder that absence of evidence is not evidence of absence when the archive itself has been drowned. This is where the language of ages becomes useful. An age does not require skyscrapers or machines. An age can be defined by a way of living, a relationship with the land, a mode of understanding time and death. A society deeply attuned to cycles, seasons, and sky movements could be advanced in ways we struggle to measure. Its collapse would not leave behind factories. It would leave behind stories, and stories, once loosened from their original context, begin to drift. They attach themselves to gods. They turn geography into allegory. They compress centuries into a single flood, a single fire, a single divine decision. But compression is not fabrication. It is survival under pressure. If this is true, then the ancient insistence on cycles is not a philosophical abstraction. It is an inheritance of experience. The knowledge that nothing built by humans is permanent, that order is always borrowed, That civilization is not a trophy handed down once, but a condition that must be re-earned again and again. From this angle, the question of whether we are the 7th civilization or the 70th becomes less important than the fact that the question itself keeps returning. Each culture seems compelled to ask it. Each seems to sense that it stands on something older than its own memory. And perhaps that is the quiet warning embedded in these ancient records. Not that catastrophe is inevitable tomorrow, but that forgetting is inevitable if we believe ourselves unique. The moment a civilization assumes it is the first, it also assumes it will be the last. That assumption breeds carelessness. It dulls the instinct to preserve not only knowledge, but humility. So as the night deepens and your thoughts slow, let this idea rest without urgency. You do not need to decide what was lost or how many times it was lost. You only need to notice that the past is larger than we can comfortably hold, and that its echoes continue to shape how we imagine beginnings and endings. The cycle does not announce itself loudly. It moves quietly, like water finding the lowest place, waiting for the moment when the ground gives way again. When the ground gives way, it rarely feels like a dramatic collapse from within the moment itself. More often, it feels like continuity. Life continues. People adapt. New routines form around new limits. Only later, when enough distance has passed, does the shape of loss become visible. This is why civilizations rarely recognize their own endings. They experience them as transitions, a colder climate, a drier season, a longer walk to water, a political shift, a migration that feels temporary but becomes permanent. From the inside, collapse is incremental. From the outside, centuries later, it appears sudden. The ancient stories seem to understand this intuitively. They do not describe a slow erosion. They describe a single event, a flood, a fire, a darkness, because myth does not record processes. It records thresholds. The moment when before becomes after. The point at which memory itself is forced to divide. If you imagine yourself standing at such a threshold, the meaning of long ages begins to feel less abstract. A society that persists for thousands of years without writing would experience time differently. Its continuity would be carried in ritual, in seasonal movement, in the repetition of tasks that bind generations together. To such a society, 1,000 years might feel less like an achievement and more like a natural extension of life's rhythm. The shock would not be longevity. The shock would be interruption. This may be why ancient texts emphasize decline rather than progress. They do not celebrate novelty. They mourn distance. Each age is defined not by what it gains, but by what it no longer has. Shorter lives, weaker bonds, less clarity. The direction of time feels like a narrowing corridor rather than an open horizon. That feeling is deeply human. Even now, we measure our lives against a remembered past that feels simpler, calmer, more meaningful, whether or not it truly was. On a civilizational scale, that instinct becomes myth. It becomes the golden age, the age when gods walked closer, when humans understood their place, when the world felt aligned. But alignment is fragile. It depends on balance between people and land, between growth and restraint, between knowledge and humility. When balance tips too far, the correction can be gentle or violent. In the ancient imagination, it is often violent, because violence leaves marks that cannot be ignored. The flood in this sense is not only water, it is correction. It is the world reminding its inhabitants that it is not built for permanence. That message does not require supernatural intervention. Climate alone is enough. A shift of a few degrees can redraw maps. A change in rainfall can end a city. The ancient mind, lacking our vocabulary, gave these forces faces and names, but the experience underneath was real. If civilizations before us rose and fell, they did so under different skies, with different tools, facing different limits. Some may have reached heights we would not recognize as technological. Others may have organized themselves around values we no longer prioritize. Their achievements would not leave behind satellites or steel. They would leave behind alignments, stories, calendars, and questions. This is why the search for lost civilizations can miss the point. We look for ruins that resemble us. We look for roads and machines. We look for evidence that flatters our idea of advancement. But a civilization deeply attuned to ecology, to oral transmission, to cyclical time, might leave almost nothing we are trained to notice. And yet, traces remain, not as proof, but as unease, a sense that the timeline is too clean, that the beginning arrives too conveniently, that human capacity appears suddenly fully formed without enough visible rehearsal. These feelings do not overturn evidence. They invite patience. They invite us to admit that our picture of the past is provisional. As you hold that thought, you may feel the story widening again. The Sumerian prism becomes one voice among many, not shouting, not insisting, but whispering across time that this has happened before, that memory fades, that rebuilding follows, that the world does not end once, but repeatedly, each time believing itself new. And in that whisper is a quiet challenge, not to fear collapse, but to understand continuity differently. To see civilization not as a line we extend forward, but as a flame we inherit. A flame that has gone out many times before, only to be lit again by those who remembered just enough to begin. Let that image rest with you. A small flame carried through darkness, protected by cupped hands, passed from one age to the next. The question is no longer whether others carried it before us. The question is whether we will know how to carry it when the wind changes again. When the wind changes, it does not announce itself. It arrives quietly, disguised as normal weather, and only later do people realize that the seasons have shifted for good. Civilizations experience change the same way. By the time the word crisis is spoken aloud, the deeper forces have already been moving for generations. Ancient cultures seem to sense this long before they could measure it. Their myths are not obsessed with sudden endings alone, but with imbalance. Too much noise, too much pride, too much forgetting. In the Mesopotamian stories, humanity grows loud enough to disturb the gods. In other traditions, humans drift too far from harmony. These are not childish moral tales. They are metaphors for systems under strain, for societies pushing beyond what their environment or social fabric can quietly sustain. Seen through this lens, catastrophe is not punishment. It is feedback, a signal that something has drifted too far out of alignment. The flood arrives not because a deity is angry, but because the system can no longer hold. Rivers change course, ice melts, rains intensify, drought follows abundance. The ancient mind wrapped these forces in story because story was the only language vast enough to hold them. If civilizations before ours existed, they would have faced the same limits, even if their tools and values were different. No society escapes entropy. Complexity requires energy. Energy requires balance. When balance breaks, complexity collapses into something simpler, something more survivable. That collapse is not always a failure. Sometimes it is the only way life continues at all. This is why the idea of repeated civilizations does not have to be tragic. It can be sobering, yes, but also strangely reassuring. It suggests that humanity is resilient not because it builds forever, but because it rebuilds. It suggests that knowledge does not vanish entirely. It mutates. It hides. It waits for conditions where it can be useful again. You can feel this waiting in ancient symbols. A spiral carved into stone. A calendar that tracks not years, but returns. a story that insists the end is also a beginning. These are not the obsessions of naive people. They are the coping mechanisms of cultures that have seen continuity break before and learned to expect it. Modern thinking often resists this. We prefer progress narratives. We prefer arrows pointing forward. Cycles feel regressive, pessimistic, even threatening. But cycles do not deny growth. They place growth inside a larger rhythm. They say that advancement happens, but it is not permanent. It must be renewed, re-earned, rebalanced. When ancient texts say that lifespans were longer in earlier ages, they may not be speaking biologically at all. They may be speaking about coherence, about lives that felt longer because they were embedded in stable patterns, in predictable seasons, in stories that did not fracture every generation. A shorter lifespan, in that sense, is not only years lived, it is a life compressed by instability. This reframing changes how the king list reads. The decline is not only numerical, it is experiential. A move from vast, slow time to hurried, fragile time. From eras where change was gradual to eras where it accelerates. From worlds where memory could stretch across generations to worlds where memory struggles to survive a single lifetime. If that is true, then the prism is not warning us about immortal kings. It is warning us about speed, about how quickly a world can begin to feel thin, rushed, forgetful, about how easily continuity can fracture once acceleration replaces balance. And suddenly, without forcing the comparison, the ancient story feels uncomfortably close. We live in an age of unprecedented speed. Information moves faster than memory can stabilize. Technologies outpace the ethics designed to guide them. Landscapes change within a lifetime. What once took centuries now takes decades, sometimes years. This does not mean we are doomed. It means we are familiar to the pattern, familiar to the moment when a civilization believes itself permanent because it has not yet experienced the scale of its own fragility. The ancient stories are not predictions, they are reminders. They say this has happened before, not in the same way, not with the same tools, but with the same human tendencies. Expansion without pause, confidence without humility, forgetting that the ground beneath us has its own rhythms. As you rest with this thought, let it remain gentle. This is not a call to fear the future. It is an invitation to see yourself inside a much longer story, one that has room for endings without finality. Civilizations fall, but humanity continues. Knowledge dims, but curiosity survives. And somewhere, always, someone is pressing meaning into clay, or stone, or memory, hoping that when the world shifts again, not everything will be lost. Someone is always pressing meaning into something durable, even when they do not know exactly who will find it or how broken the world will be when it is found. That quiet act, more than any monument, may be the true signature of civilization. Imagine a future far removed from us, a time when our own cities are layers beneath soil, when coastlines have shifted again, when names like ours survive only as sounds that feel half familiar. In that future, someone uncovers an object we once considered ordinary, a device, a symbol, a fragment of data without its context. They will argue about what it meant. They will misinterpret parts of it. They will project their own fears and hopes onto it. And in doing so, they will mirror us, standing in museums, staring at clay prisms, wondering what kind of world produced such confidence, such precision, such longing to be remembered. This symmetry is easy to miss because we tend to place ourselves at the end of the story. But the ancient imagination did not do that. It placed itself somewhere in the middle, aware of what came before and anxious about what might come after. That awareness shaped how stories were told. They were not only explanations. They were warnings folded into beauty, truths softened so they could be carried without crushing the listener. The Sumerian king list and the many traditions that echo its structure may belong to that category. Not history as we now define it, but orientation, a way of saying, this has happened, and it can happen again. A way of situating a people inside a cosmos that is older, larger, and less forgiving than any single city. When ancient cultures spoke of God's withdrawing, of heaven lifting away from earth, they may have been describing the felt experience of losing coherence, a sense that the world no longer responds as it once did, that rituals lose their power, that knowledge no longer fits the conditions it was designed for. In modern language, we might call this systemic collapse. In ancient language, it becomes divine absence. Neither description is wrong. They are translations across time. What matters is that these stories survive, not because they predict our fate, but because they remind us that fate is not static. It is shaped by attention, by restraint, by the ability to notice imbalance before it hardens into disaster. Ancient peoples encoded this wisdom in cycles because cycles teach patience. They teach that peaks are temporary, but so are valleys. As this realization settles, the idea of multiple civilizations no longer feels like a challenge to our uniqueness. It feels like an expansion of kinship. If others rose before us and fell, then we are not alone in our uncertainty. We are part of a lineage of builders and rememberers, each inheriting a world already shaped by loss and possibility. And perhaps this is why the ancient stories are so calm about endings. They do not scream. They do not panic. They describe destruction with the same tone they describe creation. Because in a cyclical universe, the end of one form is the condition for another. Grief and renewal are not opposites. They are partners. So let the night hold this thought for you, that whatever came before us, whether 7 civilizations or 70, they were human. They wondered. They built. They failed. They tried again. And in their quiet way, they reached forward, leaving traces not so we would admire them, but so we would remember that we, too, are temporary. The question that remains is not how many times this has happened, but how gently we can carry what we have, knowing that one day it will be someone else's fragment, someone else's mystery, resting in the dark, waiting to be noticed. Waiting to be noticed is a strange form of endurance, but it may be the only kind that survives deep time. Stone cracks. Metal corrodes. Languages drift until they no longer recognize themselves. What remains is not certainty, but suggestion, an outline that invites the next mind to step inside and imagine. As we move further into this story, the question subtly changes shape. It is no longer only about whether civilizations existed before ours. It becomes about how ancient people understood their place within time itself. The cyclical worldview did not emerge from abstraction. It emerged from observation, from watching rivers rise and fall, from watching stars return to the same positions after long absences, from watching empires bloom and fade within the span of a few generations. In such a world, linear progress would feel like a fragile illusion. Stability would be recognized as temporary by default. This is why so many ancient calendars are not built to count endlessly forward, but to reset. They are designed to complete themselves, to return to a beginning that is not naive, but seasoned by what came before. The Sumerians were not alone in this. Across the ancient world, timekeeping was an act of cosmology. To measure time was to participate in the order of the universe. Days mirrored celestial movements. Years echoed agricultural cycles. Great ages aligned with astronomical rhythms so vast they bordered on the incomprehensible. In this view, human history was not separate from cosmic history. It was nested within it. When ancient texts speak of kingship descending from heaven, they may be encoding this nesting. Authority, order, and legitimacy are not inventions of humans alone. They are reflections of a larger pattern. When the pattern holds, civilization flourishes. When it fractures, civilization falters. The gods withdrawing is another way of saying the pattern no longer aligns. This alignment between sky and society is not mystical thinking in the modern sense. It is systems thinking expressed through myth. The sky was the most stable system ancient people knew. The stars returned faithfully. The planets moved with predictable grace. When human systems mirrored that regularity, life felt meaningful. When they did not, anxiety crept in. And so astronomy, religion, and governance braided together. The king was not just a ruler, he was a timekeeper, a mediator between cycles above and cycles below. His reign length mattered not because of personal longevity, but because it symbolized continuity. When reigns shortened, it signaled disruption, not only political, but cosmic. This helps explain why ancient lists cared so deeply about order and sequence. The names mattered less than the pattern they formed. To break the list, to alter its structure, would be to disrupt the memory of alignment itself. Preservation became an ethical act. Accuracy became devotion. If we allow this perspective, the idea of earlier civilizations becomes less radical. It becomes almost expected. In a cyclical universe, beginnings are never absolute. They are renewals. What we call the first city may simply be the first city after forgetting. What we call the dawn of history may be the dawn after a long night. This does not diminish the achievements of known civilizations. It deepens them. It suggests they were not naive pioneers stumbling in darkness, but inheritors working with fragments, rebuilding under constraints they only partially understood. Their myths are not claims of superiority, they are acknowledgments of loss. As you follow this thread, notice how gently it asks you to release the need for a single origin. The world does not require one. Life does not behave that way. It repeats, adapts, and continues, not because it remembers everything, but because it remembers enough. And perhaps that is the most human lesson embedded in these ancient stories. Survival does not demand total knowledge. It demands continuity of care, a willingness to pass something forward even if its meaning is incomplete, a trust that future minds will do the same, standing in their own quiet rooms, listening for echoes that refuse to fade. Echoes that refuse to fade have a way of gathering around the same questions, no matter how much time passes between those who ask them. One of those questions sits quietly beneath all the others, rarely spoken directly, yet always present. What exactly is remembered when a civilization remembers itself? Memory is not a perfect archive. It is a filter. It keeps what feels essential and lets the rest dissolve. When ancient cultures looked backward, they did not catalog tools or daily routines in the way modern historians might wish. They remembered thresholds. They remembered harmony and its loss. They remembered that the world once felt more whole, and that something happened to fracture that feeling. This is why so many ancient accounts blur the boundary between human history and cosmic drama. A flood is never just water. It is the moment when order fails. Fire is never just flame. It is transformation that cannot be controlled. Darkness is never simply night. It is the absence of orientation. These are not exaggerations. They are translations of lived experience into symbols large enough to carry emotional truth across generations. When we ask whether ancient people were describing literal events or symbolic ones, we may be imposing a division they did not recognize. For them, the symbolic and the literal were intertwined. A flood could be a real inundation and a cosmic reset at the same time. One did not cancel the other. Meaning was layered, not exclusive. If civilizations rose before ours, they would have faced the same challenge we face now. How do you warn the future without knowing its language? How do you preserve insight when you cannot preserve context? How do you tell people not yet born that the world is fragile without sounding like myth or superstition? The solution, again and again, was story. Not story as entertainment, but story as vessel. A form flexible enough to survive translation. A form that could be retold, reshaped, and still retain its core. Over time, details would shift, gods would change names, landscapes would move, but the pattern would endure. This endurance is what gives ancient traditions their unsettling consistency. Different cultures speak of long ages followed by catastrophe, not because they copied one another, but because the shape of the experience demanded that shape of memory. Slow flourishing, sudden correction, rebuilding under loss. It is the rhythm of systems everywhere, from forests to stars. Modern thought often separates myth from data, story from fact. Ancient thought did not. It understood that facts without story are easily forgotten, and stories without grounding eventually float free. By binding them together, ancient cultures ensured that something would survive, even if it survived imperfectly. When you place yourself inside that continuity, the question of being the seventh civilization becomes less literal and more reflective. 7 is not only a count, it is a symbol of completion, of cycles fulfilled. To say we are the seventh is to say we are not at the beginning and not at the end. We are somewhere in the turning. This perspective carries a quiet responsibility, not a burden, but an awareness. If others stood where we stand now, convinced of their permanence, then humility becomes a form of intelligence. It becomes a way of aligning with reality rather than fighting it. As the night deepens and your attention softens, let this idea settle without resistance. History is not a straight corridor leading to us. It is a wide field marked by many paths, some visible, some erased. We walk one of them now, carrying fragments we did not create, toward a future that will one day look back at us as an echo. And like all echoes, what matters is not how loud we are, but how clearly the shape of our time can be heard when the sound finally returns. When the sound finally returns, it does not arrive as a full voice. It comes as a resonance, a vibration that tells future listeners something once stood here and mattered enough to leave an imprint. This is the strange mercy of time. It erases detail, but it preserves shape. To sense that shape, we have to step back from individual cultures and look at the shared instincts beneath them. Across continents and centuries, humans have marked certain moments as beginnings, not because nothing existed before, but because something essential changed. Agriculture replaces foraging, cities replace villages, writing replaces memory. Each transition feels like a birth, yet each one is built on older foundations that rarely receive equal attention. This selective remembering creates the illusion of firstness. We call a civilization the first because it is the first we can clearly see, the first with writing, the first with cities we can excavate, the first with monuments that survive. But visibility is not origin, it is survival, and survival favors certain materials, certain climates, certain ways of living over others. Imagine a coastal culture that built with wood, reed, and fiber. Imagine its knowledge stored in song, navigation, and seasonal movement. Imagine its sacred centers placed along shorelines now submerged. Such a culture could thrive for thousands of years and leave almost nothing recognizable after the seas rose. Its absence would not mean it never existed. It would mean it chose a way of life that did not fossilize easily. The ancient stories seem to whisper about these absences. They do not describe steel and machines. They describe wisdom, longevity, harmony, proximity to the sacred. These are qualities, not artifacts. They suggest a kind of advancement measured not by domination of nature, but by integration with it. When that integration fails, collapse does not look like ruins. It looks like dispersal. This is where the idea of decline becomes subtle. A decline in ancient texts may not mean technological regression. It may mean a loss of coherence, a shortening of attention, a narrowing of perspective, a life lived faster, louder, and with less margin for error. In that sense, decline can happen even as tools improve. The King List's diminishing reigns can be read through this lens, not as shrinking lifespans alone, but as shrinking eras of stability. Each age holds together for less time before fracturing. Each system becomes more brittle. Complexity increases, but resilience decreases. The world feels more impressive and more fragile at the same time. This pattern is not limited to antiquity. It appears wherever systems grow dense and interconnected. When everything depends on everything else, small disruptions cascade. Ancient people felt this intuitively. They expressed it through gods withdrawing, through heavens shifting, through ages ending. If civilizations before ours reached moments like this, their stories would naturally emphasize loss over triumph. Triumph is fleeting. Loss lingers. It shapes identity. It teaches caution. It encourages remembrance. The myths we inherit may be less about celebrating what once was and more about warning what always happens. As you rest with this idea, notice how gently it reframes fear. Collapse is no longer a singular horror waiting in the future. It is a recurring condition that humanity has already survived many times. Not comfortably, not without grief, but with enough continuity to try again. And this may be the most calming thought of all. Not that we are invincible, but that we are practiced. We carry within us the accumulated experience of countless recoveries, even if we no longer recognize their sources. We are shaped by lessons learned long before names were written down. So when ancient voices speak of ages before ours, they may not be asking us to believe in lost empires with impossible technologies. They may be asking us to remember something quieter and more demanding. That civilization is not a permanent achievement. It is a behavior, one that must be chosen again and again, under changing skies, with imperfect memory, guided by echoes that refuse to fade. Echoes that refuse to fade eventually draw attention to the sky because the sky is the oldest memory humans share. Long before writing, before cities, before kings, there was the slow, dependable movement of lights above, repeating with a patience no human institution could match. If anything felt eternal to ancient people, it was the heavens. This is why cycles of civilization are so often tied to cycles of the cosmos. When earthly order failed, the sky remained. When cities flooded or burned, the stars returned to their places. To a people living close to nature, this contrast was profound. It suggested that true stability existed elsewhere, and that human life was a reflection, sometimes accurate and sometimes distorted, of a deeper rhythm. The idea that ages correspond to cosmic movements may sound abstract now, but to ancient observers it was practical knowledge. Seasonal stars told them when to plant. Planetary cycles informed ritual calendars. Eclipses, rare and unsettling, marked moments of transition. Over generations, these observations accumulated into a worldview where time itself was layered, nested, and alive. If a civilization endured long enough, it would begin to notice patterns that exceeded individual memory. Not just the return of constellations, but slow shifts, subtle changes in where the sun rose across centuries. The gradual drift of the equinoxes, imperceptible in one lifetime, but undeniable over many. These were the movements that hinted at great cycles, at ages far longer than any dynasty. To encode such vast spans of time, ancient cultures needed symbols. Numbers became sacred, ratios became meaningful, kings became placeholders for eras. In this context, the enormous reigns of early rulers no longer feel like exaggeration. They feel like containers, vessels meant to hold time too large to describe directly. When the Sumerian text says kingship descended from heaven, it may also be saying that order follows cosmic law. When that law is mirrored on earth, societies flourish. When it is ignored or misunderstood, imbalance grows. The flood then becomes not an interruption, but a correction, a return to alignment through destruction and renewal. Other traditions express this idea with different imagery, but the structure remains. Great cycles unfold. Humanity moves through phases of clarity and confusion. Knowledge waxes and wanes, and always the sky continues, indifferent yet instructive. If earlier civilizations existed, they too would have looked upward for guidance. They would have marked stones, aligned structures, memorized star paths. Even if their buildings vanished, their astronomical knowledge might survive indirectly, embedded in myths, rituals, and calendars inherited by those who came after. This raises a quiet possibility. Some of what we attribute to sudden brilliance in early historical civilizations may be inheritance rather than invention. Not stolen knowledge, but rediscovered alignment. Fragments of understanding carried forward through story until conditions allowed them to be expressed again in stone and number. Such continuity does not require a lost golden empire ruling the world. It requires only persistence, a handful of survivors, a tradition remembered, a song that preserves a pattern long after its original explanation is gone. Over time, these fragments can feel miraculous, as if they appeared from nowhere, when in fact they emerged from deep time. As you follow this thread, notice how the story resists spectacle. It does not demand dramatic revelations. It offers something quieter and more enduring. The idea that humanity is engaged in a long conversation with the cosmos, one that resets and resumes, forgets and remembers again and again. And in that conversation, civilizations are sentences rather than chapters. They carry meaning forward for a time, then trail off, leaving space for the next voice. The sky listens to them all, unchanged, waiting for whoever looks up next and begins, once more, to ask where they are in the turning of the ages. Where we are in the turning of the ages is not marked by a signpost. There is no line etched into the sky that says now. Instead, the position is felt indirectly, through tension, through acceleration, through a sense that systems once trusted are no longer as steady as they appeared. Ancient people recognized this sensation. They did not measure it with instruments, but with omens, with stories, with the tone of their myths. When stories began to darken, when gods became distant, when heroes struggled rather than triumphed, it signaled a shift in the collective understanding of the world. The age was changing. In many traditions, the final phase of a cycle is not defined by sudden destruction, but by confusion. Knowledge multiplies, but wisdom thins. Tools become powerful, but purpose becomes unclear. Society grows louder, faster, more crowded, yet less certain of its direction. These descriptions feel unsettlingly familiar because they describe a pattern, not a prophecy. This does not mean that ancient cultures predicted our world. It means they recognize dynamics that repeat wherever complexity grows unchecked. Any system that expands faster than its capacity for reflection eventually strains. When reflection fails, correction arrives from outside the system, through forces it can no longer control. The flood, The fire, the darkness, these are not only memories of past disasters, they are metaphors for systemic reset. Water dissolves boundaries. Fire simplifies. Darkness removes orientation. Each strips away excess and forces a return to essentials. Afterward, life continues, but rearranged. If civilizations before ours passed through similar thresholds, they would have left behind warnings framed as stories. Not warnings in the modern sense of prediction, but in the sense of orientation. A way of saying this is how it felt when things began to come apart. Pay attention. The Sumerian scribes did this by preserving the king list exactly as it was received, not because they understood every number, but because fidelity mattered more than interpretation. They trusted that meaning would unfold over time, that future generations would hear something in the pattern that they themselves could not fully articulate. This trust is one of the most striking features of ancient thought. It assumes continuity beyond collapse. It assumes listeners who have not yet been born. It assumes that even if a civilization ends, humanity does not. That someone will always be there to pick up the fragment and wonder. As you let this settle, the idea of deep cycles becomes less abstract and more intimate. It is no longer about lost worlds buried under oceans. It is about how humans relate to time when they accept that permanence is an illusion. It is about how stories become tools for survival, carrying guidance forward when institutions fail. And perhaps this is why the question of earlier civilizations persists, even without definitive proof. It resonates with something we already know intuitively, that what we call modernity feels both unprecedented and strangely familiar. That the sense of standing at a turning point is not unique to us, but part of a long human inheritance. If that inheritance includes the memory of previous endings, then it also includes the memory of rebuilding. The knowledge that after collapse there is work to do, fields to tend, children to teach, stories to tell. The cycle does not end in silence. It pauses, then begins again. So, wherever we are now in the turning, we are not alone there. Others have stood at similar edges, feeling the same mixture of confidence and unease, building their worlds with the same hope that this time might be different. Their traces surround us, not as ruins alone, but as patterns waiting to be recognized. And as the night continues, you may feel the story stretching, looping back on itself, like time does when it refuses to be a straight line. When time refuses to be a straight line, it invites a different kind of attention. Instead of racing forward, the mind begins to circle, returning to the same ideas with deeper awareness each time. This is how ancient thought moved, not toward conclusions, but toward orientation. Orientation matters more than answers in a cyclical world. Answers can expire. Orientation adapts. It teaches you how to stand when the ground shifts, how to recognize patterns even when details change. This may be why so many ancient traditions focused less on predicting the future and more on recognizing the signs of imbalance in the present. In stories of declining ages, the warning is rarely subtle. Humans forget their place. They overreach. They treat the world as inexhaustible. They mistake temporary success for permanent entitlement. These are not accusations aimed at any one era. They are descriptions of a recurring phase, a stage every complex society eventually enters. What follows is not immediate destruction, but fragility. Systems become tightly coupled. Small failures cascade. The margin for error disappears. From within the civilization, this feels like bad luck, like a series of unrelated crises. From outside, or from far in the future, it looks like the slow tightening of a knot. Ancient people did not use our language of systems and feedback loops, but they understood the feeling. They expressed it through gods arguing, through natural forces turning hostile, through moral decay. The imagery is dramatic, but the insight is precise. When balance is lost, correction is inevitable. This is where the idea of multiple civilizations becomes emotionally charged. If others reached this phase before us, then the stories they left behind are not distant curiosities. They are mirrors, not exact reflections, but familiar enough to unsettle. And yet the ancient tone is rarely despairing. Even in the darkest ages, there is an assumption of continuation. The cycle does not end with annihilation. It bends, it contracts, it sheds complexity until what remains can survive. Then, slowly, almost imperceptibly, it begins to expand again. This resilience is not heroic. It is quiet. It belongs to farmers who save seeds, to storytellers who repeat the same tale until children can recite it by heart, to builders who align foundations with the same stars their ancestors used, even when they no longer know why. If a civilization existed before ours, and another before that, their greatest legacy may not be technology or monuments, but this behavior, the instinct to preserve something essential through uncertainty, the understanding that survival depends as much on memory as on strength. In this light, the ancient fascination with cycles becomes practical rather than mystical. It is a way of managing expectations, a way of teaching that no peak lasts forever, but no collapse erases everything, that life continues, altered but persistent, carrying forward what it can. As you hold this thought, notice how it softens fear. The future becomes less like a cliff and more like a bend in a long road. You cannot see what lies beyond it, but you know others have turned similar corners before. They left markers, not to map the way precisely, but to say you are not the first to feel this uncertainty. And so the story continues, not toward a final revelation, but toward a deeper calm. The calm that comes from realizing that even in forgetting, humanity remembers enough to begin again. To realize that forgetting and remembering coexist is to step into a quieter understanding of history. It is not a record of perfection lost, nor a march toward inevitability, but a rhythm of attention and neglect, of care and exhaustion, repeating in different forms. Ancient cultures seem to accept this without resistance. Their stories rarely promise escape from the cycle. Instead, they teach how to move within it, how to recognize when an age is ripening, how to sense when it is thinning, how to live in a way that leaves something behind even when outcomes cannot be controlled. This is why so much ancient wisdom is indirect. It does not tell you what will happen. It tells you how to watch. Pay attention to excess. Notice imbalance. Observe how quickly things are changing. Listen to what no longer works the way it once did. These are not predictions. They are diagnostics. When civilizations begin to fracture, the earliest signs are rarely dramatic. They appear as disconnection between people and land, between labor and meaning, between knowledge and responsibility. Ancient myths encode this as gods withdrawing, but the lived experience would have been simpler and more painful. Traditions stop making sense. Rules feel arbitrary. The old stories feel distant, even embarrassing. At that point, a society often accelerates rather than slows. It builds more, extracts more, distracts itself with novelty. This acceleration feels like vitality, but it is often a response to anxiety, the sense that time is running out, even if nobody can say why. If earlier civilizations existed, they would have felt this too. Not in the same way, not with the same tools, but with the same underlying tension. The feeling that something essential is slipping, and that speed might compensate for loss of direction. The ancient insistence on cycles may have been an antidote to this impulse, a reminder that rushing does not escape endings, that expansion without reflection leads only to sharper contraction. By framing time as a wheel rather than a line, these cultures built restraint into their worldview. This restraint is easy to overlook because it does not announce itself. It appears in rituals that slow time, in calendars that require pauses, in taboos that limit growth, in stories that warn against hubris without needing to name it. From a modern perspective, this can look like superstition or conservatism, but from within a cyclical understanding, it is adaptive intelligence. It is the recognition that systems survive not by maximizing output, but by maintaining balance over long spans. As this thought settles, the question of how many civilizations came before becomes almost secondary. Whether there were 6, 10, or countless cycles matters less than the pattern they collectively point to. A pattern of rise driven by curiosity and cooperation. A pattern of decline driven by excess and forgetting. A pattern of renewal carried by memory and necessity. And always beneath the pattern, the same human core. People seeking meaning. People trying to care for one another. People telling stories in the dark to make sense of forces larger than themselves. This continuity is easy to miss when we focus only on difference. Different tools, different gods, different names for the same sky. But difference sits on top of sameness like new growth on old roots. So as the night deepens and the world outside grows quieter, let this idea rest without urgency. Humanity has been here before, at moments of confidence and uncertainty intertwined. Others have wondered if they were late in the cycle or early in the next. They left behind not answers, but ways of seeing, and those ways of seeing are still with us, waiting patiently, asking only that we slow down enough to notice them. Noticing requires stillness, and stillness is something civilizations rarely reward when they are in motion. Yet it is often in moments of quiet that patterns reveal themselves most clearly. Ancient cultures created spaces for this intentionally, through ritual pauses, through sacred days, through stories told slowly and repeatedly, not to entertain, but to recalibrate attention. In a cyclical worldview, attention is survival. To notice subtle shifts in climate, in soil, in social cohesion, is to gain time. Time to adapt. Time to soften impact. Time to carry something forward. When attention is lost, change feels sudden and catastrophic, even if it has been approaching for generations. This may be why ancient narratives return so often to the theme of forgetting. Forgetting is not ignorance. It is distraction. It is the gradual replacement of awareness with habit, of listening with assuming. When cultures forget how to listen to the world around them, they become surprised by outcomes that were always in motion. If civilizations rose before ours and fell, their fall may not have felt like failure in the moment. It may have felt like confusion, like rules no longer working, like rituals losing meaning, like the sky still turning, but no longer answering in the same way. These are the experiences that later become mythologized as gods withdrawing or ages ending. From this perspective, the ancient emphasis on memory takes on a deeper meaning. Memory is not nostalgia. It is calibration. To remember how things once felt is to sense when they feel wrong again. Memory becomes a compass, not a museum. The Sumerian scribes copying the king list were not preserving trivia. They were preserving orientation, a sense of scale, a reminder that time has depth beyond immediate experience, that before this order there was another, and that this order, too, would someday pass into story. Other cultures expressed this orientation differently, but the impulse was the same: to situate the present within a much larger arc, to reduce arrogance by expanding perspective, to teach humility not as weakness, but as alignment with reality. If we are indeed one civilization among many, then humility is not optional. It is adaptive. It allows learning without superiority. It allows inheritance without ownership. It allows gratitude for what exists now without assuming it must exist forever. As you let this settle, notice how the fear associated with collapse begins to loosen. What remains is responsibility, not the responsibility to prevent all change, which is impossible, but the responsibility to carry forward what is most essential, to choose what deserves memory. Ancient cultures chose stories, they chose symbols, they chose patterns that could survive translation. They accepted that details would be lost but trusted that shape would remain. This trust is an act of generosity toward the future. And now, quietly, the story turns toward us. Not to accuse, not to predict, but to ask. What are we choosing to preserve? What are we pressing into our own forms of clay? What patterns will remain when the details of our age have eroded? These questions do not demand immediate answers. They are meant to accompany you, to sit gently beside your thoughts as you rest. Like all meaningful questions in a cyclical world, they are not solved once. They are returned to again and again, each time with slightly deeper understanding. Returned to again and again, questions deepen not because answers accumulate, but because perspective widens. This is how ancient wisdom works. It does not resolve uncertainty. It teaches how to live alongside it without panic. When cultures imagined themselves inside great cycles, they did not see uncertainty as failure. They saw it as a condition of being human in a world that changes faster than memory can fully track. This acceptance softened the fear of endings. If endings are part of the pattern, then they are not punishments. They are transitions, difficult and costly, but not meaningless. This may explain why ancient texts often blur the line between catastrophe and renewal. The same flood that destroys also fertilizes. The same fire that consumes also clears ground for new growth. Destruction and creation are not opposites. They are phases of the same movement. For a civilization that has already experienced loss, this understanding is not abstract. It is lived knowledge. Survivors know that the world does not return to what it was. It becomes something else. The task is not restoration, but adaptation. Not nostalgia, but continuity. If civilizations existed before ours, they would have faced this task repeatedly. Each cycle would require decisions about what to carry forward and what to let go. Not everything can be saved. Selection becomes inevitable. And selection reveals values. What did ancient cultures value enough to encode in myth and ritual? They valued balance. They valued restraint. They valued continuity across generations. They valued alignment with forces larger than themselves. These values are not accidental. They are survival strategies refined through experience. The idea of long ages before catastrophe may reflect periods when these values held. The idea of decline may reflect moments when they were abandoned. Lifespans shorten not only because bodies weaken, but because societies lose the conditions that allow long, stable lives to feel possible. This reading does not require supernatural beings to be literal. Gods can be understood as names for forces that exceed individual control. Climate, fertility, chaos, order. When gods argue or withdraw, it mirrors the instability of the systems they represent. Seen this way, ancient mythology becomes a language of systems long before systems theory existed. It encodes cause and effect in narrative form. Excess leads to correction. Forgetting leads to collapse. Memory enables renewal. As you sit with this, the idea of being a later civilization feels less like a loss of prestige and more like an inheritance of responsibility. Others have already paid the cost of learning these lessons. Their stories are attempts to spare us some portion of that cost, even if they cannot eliminate it. The tragedy is not that cycles repeat. The tragedy is when knowledge of the cycle is ignored, when warnings are dismissed as superstition, when humility is mistaken for weakness, when speed replaces listening. Yet even this tragedy has precedent. Ancient cultures knew that forgetting was inevitable. This is why stories are repeated, not once, but endlessly. This is why rituals loop. This is why calendars reset. Repetition is the antidote to distraction. So if you feel the story circling, returning to familiar ground, that is intentional. You are being invited into the same rhythm ancient listeners experienced. Not a march toward revelation, but a gentle turning that slowly reorients how time itself feels. And in that turning, something subtle happens. The present moment loosens its claim to absolute importance. It becomes one moment among many, precious precisely because it is temporary. The weight of now lightens, replaced by a sense of participation in something far older and far larger than any single age. Participation in something far older than any single age changes how responsibility feels. It becomes less about control and more about stewardship, less about guaranteeing outcomes and more about tending conditions. Ancient cultures seem to understand this instinctively. They did not believe they owned the world. They believed they were borrowing it, briefly, from forces that would outlast them. This belief shaped how they spoke about beginnings. A beginning was not creation from nothing. It was reordering, a return to balance after disruption. Even the act of creation itself is often described as organizing chaos rather than inventing substance. Water recedes, land emerges. Light separates from darkness. These are not first events. They are adjustments. If civilizations before ours followed similar patterns, their beginnings would also be reorganizations, not origins. People gathering again after dispersal, knowledge reassembled from fragments, new structures built atop old intuitions. The world would feel both familiar and strange, carrying echoes without explanations. This may be why ancient texts often describe early humans as closer to the sacred, more attuned, longer lived, not because they were biologically different, but because they lived in smaller, slower systems where feedback was immediate. When the land suffered, everyone noticed. When balance was lost, consequences arrived quickly. Awareness was built into daily life. As systems grow larger, awareness diffuses. Cause and effect stretch apart. Harm becomes abstract. Responsibility becomes fragmented. In such conditions, people can live comfortably while the foundations of that comfort quietly erode. Ancient myths compress this process into moral decline, but the underlying insight is systemic. Distance from consequence breeds instability. The idea of a golden age, then, is not naive nostalgia. It is a memory of coherence. A time when actions and outcomes were tightly linked, when stories still matched experience, when the scale of life allowed understanding to keep pace with change. Losing that coherence feels like a fall, even if material conditions improve. If earlier civilizations reached moments where scale outpaced awareness, their collapse would not feel like sudden punishment. It would feel like disorientation, like living in a world where old rules no longer apply, but new ones have not yet emerged. That liminal space is deeply uncomfortable. It invites myth because myth gives shape to uncertainty. Ancient cultures filled that space with stories of gods arguing, withdrawing, resetting the world. These stories provided a framework for meaning when direct understanding failed. They said the world is changing because something fundamental is out of balance. They offered no easy fix, only the assurance that balance could return, even if through loss. This assurance is crucial. Without it, despair would dominate memory. With it, resilience becomes possible. The cycle does not promise comfort, but it promises continuity. Something always survives, seeds, stories, skills. Even when the world breaks, it does not break completely. As you let this settle, notice how the idea of multiple civilizations becomes less dramatic and more intimate. It is not about lost continents or forbidden knowledge. It is about repeated human attempts to live well within limits and repeated failures to remember those limits for long. Each cycle adds experience to the human inheritance, even as it erases detail. We do not remember who lived before us, but we remember that living well requires balance. We do not know how many times the world has reset, but we know that it can reset, and that survival depends on adaptation rather than denial. This knowing is quiet. It does not announce itself as certainty. It feels more like intuition, like something recognized rather than learned. Perhaps that is why the ancient stories feel so familiar even when their imagery is strange. They are speaking to a part of the mind that has always understood that nothing lasts forever, and that this truth, rather than diminishing life, gives it depth. Depth changes how time is felt. When life is understood as layered rather than linear, urgency softens. The present moment does not disappear, but it settles into context. It becomes one wave among many, shaped by what came before and shaping what will follow. Ancient cultures lived with this depth close at hand. Burial grounds sat near homes. Ruins stood beside new buildings. Stories of ancestors were not distant history, but active presence. The past was not sealed off. It breathed alongside the living. This proximity made cycles tangible rather than theoretical. If civilizations before ours existed and fell, their memory would not vanish cleanly. It would linger as intuition, as an unease about permanence, as a respect for forces that exceed planning. Even without names or dates, the experience would imprint itself on how humans approach risk, ritual, and meaning. This may be why so many traditions emphasize preparation rather than prevention. You cannot stop the river from rising forever. You can learn when it rises. You can build in ways that bend rather than break. You can store what matters and accept what must be lost. These strategies assume change as a given, not an anomaly. The modern impulse is often the opposite. We build as if stability were guaranteed. We plan as if growth were endless. We speak of sustainability while acting as if time were short and resources infinite. This contradiction is not new. It is the hallmark of an age approaching its limits. Ancient stories recognized this tension and addressed it indirectly. They did not say, "Stop building." They said, "Remember balance." They did not say, "Abandon ambition." They said, "Honor restraint." They did not say, "Fear the future." They said, "Listen." Listening is the thread that runs through all cyclical wisdom. Listening to land. Listening to sky, listening to elders, listening to patterns that unfold slowly enough to be missed by those who only look for spectacle. When listening fails, cycles accelerate. Corrections become harsher. If earlier civilizations reached this stage, their stories would naturally focus on loss of listening, noise replacing harmony, speed replacing patience. The gods becoming irritated not because of moral outrage, but because systems under strain generate friction. Noise is a metaphor for overload. The flood then becomes silence, a reset of signal. Afterward, the world is quieter, simpler, more comprehensible, at least for a time. Survivors rebuild with heightened awareness, knowing how easily complexity can collapse. This heightened awareness does not last forever. Memory fades, comfort returns. The cycle begins again, not because humans are foolish, but because forgetting is part of being alive. Attention cannot remain fully awake indefinitely. Rest is necessary. So is renewal. Seen this way, the idea of being the seventh civilization is not a verdict. It is a position. a place on the curve where knowledge and forgetting intersect, where inherited wisdom is available, but not guaranteed to be used, where choice still exists. And choice, even limited, matters. Ancient cultures did not believe they could escape cycles, but they believed they could shape how cycles were experienced. A collapse could be brutal or bearable. A transition could be chaotic or guided. The difference lay in whether memory was honored or ignored. As you rest with this, let the weight of the idea remain light. This story is not asking you to carry the fate of civilization. It is inviting you to feel time differently, to sense your own life as part of a longer breathing, one that has contracted and expanded many times before. In that breathing, there is room for humility without despair, for responsibility without panic, for care without illusion. The ancient stories are not telling us how the world will end. They are reminding us how the world has always changed, and how each time humanity found a way to continue, quieter perhaps, simpler perhaps, but still alive, still listening, still beginning again. Beginning again is never announced as a beginning. It feels like improvisation, like making do, like adjusting expectations downward and discovering slowly that life can still unfold within narrower margins. Ancient cultures understood this phase intimately, even if they described it through myth rather than manuals. After a collapse, the world does not feel heroic. It feels small. Travel shrinks. Trade thins. Horizons pull closer. People become more dependent on what they can see, what they can touch, what they can trust. In this contraction, something paradoxical happens. Awareness sharpens. Attention returns to essentials. Survival demands presence. This is the soil from which new civilizations grow. Not from abundance, but from constraint. Not from confidence, but from necessity. Skills are relearned, relationships tighten, rituals simplify. Knowledge becomes practical again, rooted in daily life rather than abstract systems. If earlier civilizations existed, their rebirths would have followed this pattern. Survivors would not speak of themselves as founders of something new. They would speak of restoring order, of honoring what was lost, of rebuilding what had worked before the break. Innovation would be framed as recovery. This framing is important. It preserves humility. It keeps the past alive as reference rather than relic. Even when details are forgotten, the attitude remains. The sense that what exists now is provisional, borrowed, and subject to forces beyond control. Over generations, as stability returns, memory of hardship softens. Stories become formalized, rituals accumulate, complexity grows, the world expands again, and with expansion comes distance. Distance from necessity, distance from consequence, distance from the conditions that made awareness sharp. This is where cycles turn quietly, not at the peak of catastrophe, but at the peak of comfort. When systems feel robust enough to ignore limits, when growth feels natural rather than conditional, when stories of past collapse feel symbolic rather than instructive. Ancient cultures encoded this insight deeply. They warned not against hardship, but against forgetting hardship. They treated memory as sacred not because the past was better, but because the past was instructive. Forgetting was the true danger. The Sumerian king list, with its impossible ages and sudden flood, can be read as one such instruction. It says, remember that time was once longer. Remember that something changed. Remember that order returned, but diminished. Remember that what you have now is not the first version of the world. This remembering does not demand despair. It invites care. Care in how systems are built. Care in how growth is managed. Care in how stories are told. Care in what is valued. As you sit with this moment in the narrative, notice how the story has moved from speculation about lost civilizations to something closer to reflection. The idea of being the seventh civilization is no longer about counting predecessors. It is about recognizing position, about understanding that we stand neither at the dawn nor at the end, but somewhere within a long pattern of forgetting and renewal. And perhaps this is the quiet gift of ancient cyclical thinking. It removes the pressure to be final. It frees us from the burden of being the culmination of history. It allows us to see ourselves as participants rather than protagonists. Participation carries its own dignity. It means doing the best possible work within limited time. It means preserving what matters without assuming permanence. It means accepting that others will inherit what we leave, and that they will misunderstand parts of it just as we misunderstand parts of what we inherit. The cycle does not ask for perfection. It asks for attention, for humility, for the willingness to begin again when the world narrows, and to remember when it widens that it will not stay that way forever. Forever is a word civilizations use most often when they are closest to forgetting. Ancient cultures sensed this danger and responded not by denying ambition, but by surrounding it with reminders of impermanence. Temples eroded, dynasties ended. Even the gods themselves were subject to cycles. Nothing was allowed to stand outside time. This awareness becomes especially vivid when ancient stories turn toward catastrophe, not as spectacle, but as correction. The flood, the fire, the darkness are not presented as accidents. They are portrayed as responses to imbalance, as moments when the accumulated weight of excess finally forces change. In Mesopotamian tradition, humanity grows too numerous, too loud, too demanding. The gods cannot rest. This is not merely a moral complaint. It is a metaphor for overload. A system pushed beyond its capacity to absorb activity without consequence. When feedback fails, pressure builds. When pressure builds, release becomes inevitable. The flood arrives not as chaos, but as reset. Water dissolves boundaries, erases distinctions, levels hierarchies. Cities become indistinguishable from fields. Kings lose their thrones. Wealth loses its meaning. Everything returns to the same condition, suspended, waiting. This leveling is crucial. It explains why catastrophe is remembered as total, even if its physical reach was uneven. From the perspective of those who lived through it, the world they knew ended completely. Social order collapsed. Memory fractured. The rules that once governed life no longer applied. If civilizations before ours experienced similar resets, their endings would have felt absolute. Not because every human perished, but because the continuity that defined their identity was broken. A people can survive biologically and still lose their civilization entirely. After the flood, ancient texts often describe a quieter world. Lifespans shorten. Power diminishes. The gods withdraw slightly, no longer walking as closely with humans. This is not punishment. It is distance. The world has become less intimate, more cautious, more constrained. This distance may reflect a real change in scale, smaller populations, simpler systems, fewer layers of organization. In such a world, survival is possible, but grandeur is not. Ambition narrows. Attention returns to daily sustenance. Civilization rebuilds, but with scars. The Sumerian king list encodes this shift numerically. Long ages give way to shorter ones. What once endured for cosmic spans now lasts for human spans. The arc is clear, even if the explanation is debated. Something about the human condition has changed. Other traditions mirror this exactly. After the Great Deluge, humans live shorter lives. After the Golden Age, suffering increases. After the first creation, the world becomes heavier, denser, more resistant. Different languages, same memory. This is where catastrophe becomes more than destruction. It becomes differentiation, a dividing line between modes of existence. Before, life felt expansive, aligned, open-ended. After, it feels constrained, effortful, time-bound. The world is still habitable, but it demands more from those who live within it. As you let this settle, notice how the story does not rush toward apocalypse. It lingers on transition, on the subtle reshaping of what it means to be human after loss. The catastrophe is not the climax, it is the hinge. And that hinge, according to ancient memory, has turned more than once. Turned more than once, the hinge of catastrophe becomes familiar rather than exceptional. It is no longer an unimaginable end, but a recurring passage, one that reshapes humanity each time it swings open and closed. Ancient cultures seem to understand this repetition intuitively, which is why their stories speak less about preventing catastrophe and more about surviving it with meaning intact. Survival in these narratives is never accidental. Someone listens when others do not. Someone prepares quietly. Someone carries knowledge forward while the larger system collapses under its own weight. These figures are remembered not as conquerors, but as preservers. They build boats, store seeds, memorize stories, gather animals. Their wisdom is not technological superiority. It is attentiveness. This attentiveness becomes the seed of the next world. After the waters recede or the fires cool, it is not the strongest who rebuild first, but the most adaptable. Those who understand that the old order cannot simply be restored, that rebuilding requires humility, that the future must be shaped with fewer assumptions and closer listening. If earlier civilizations existed and were erased, their survivors would have faced this same challenge. They would not have spoken of progress. They would have spoken of repair, of healing land, of renegotiating relationships with forces that had proven unforgiving. Their priorities would shift from expansion to stability. This shift is visible in the archaeological record, where complexity drops and then slowly returns. It is visible in stories where gods retreat and humans must rely more on their own judgment. It is visible in the shortening of ages, the contraction of time into something more manageable, more fragile. The ancient mind did not see this contraction as a failure of humanity. It saw it as a recalibration, a necessary narrowing after overreach. Just as a river that floods too widely eventually carves a deeper channel, civilization after catastrophe becomes more contained, more focused. Contained does not mean diminished forever. It means reset. Within this narrower channel, innovation begins again, guided by lessons learned through loss. Over generations, memory of catastrophe fades, but its imprint remains embedded in cautionary tales and sacred boundaries. This is why flood stories end not with despair, but with covenant. An agreement, implicit or explicit, that the world will continue, but under new conditions. Limits are introduced. Mortality is enforced. Excess is discouraged. These are not punishments. They are safeguards. If the cycle repeats, each iteration refines these safeguards until they, too, are forgotten or ignored. Then pressure builds again. The hinge creaks. Another turning approaches. As you follow this rhythm, notice how gently it reframes the fear of endings. An ending is not annihilation. It is compression, a return to essentials, a thinning that makes space for clarity. The danger lies not in the turning itself, but in refusing to recognize where one stands in relation to it. Ancient stories were not obsessed with the past for nostalgia's sake. They were obsessed with pattern recognition. They asked their listeners to notice when the world began to feel strained, when noise replaced harmony, when speed outpaced understanding. These were the signs that mattered. And in that noticing lay a quiet hope. Not the hope of avoiding all loss, but the hope of carrying something forward through it. The hope that even if cities vanished and names were forgotten, the deeper lesson would remain. That balance is not permanent. That humility is protective. That beginnings are possible, but never free of memory. The hinge has turned before. It will turn again. And each time humanity learns not how to escape the cycle, but how to endure it with greater awareness. Endurance shaped by awareness is different from endurance shaped by force. Force resists change until it breaks. Awareness bends, adjusts, and survives. Ancient cultures seem to understand this distinction deeply, even if they never articulated it in modern terms. When a civilization collapses through force, it shatters quickly. When it adapts through awareness, it transforms slowly. The stories that survive are not the stories of domination, but the stories of listening to warnings embedded in the land, listening to elders who remember previous failures, listening to myths not as entertainment, but as compressed experience. If civilizations before ours existed, their survival through multiple cycles would depend on this kind of listening. Not every society would manage it. Many would vanish entirely, but some would persist just long enough to pass fragments forward, fragments that would later be mistaken for myth, superstition, or exaggeration. This is where the ancient emphasis on lineage becomes important. Lineage is not only blood. It is transmission. Who taught whom? Who remembered what? Who carried which story when there was no room for libraries or monuments? In times of narrowing, lineage becomes the archive. After catastrophe, lineage determines what kind of world can be rebuilt. A lineage that remembers restraint rebuilds differently from one that remembers conquest. A lineage that remembers harmony rebuilds differently from one that remembers domination. The stories chosen for survival shape the future more than any tool. This may explain why ancient texts often present multiple versions of the same event. Different floods, different creations, different endings. These are not contradictions. They are records of multiple survivals, each preserving a slightly different lesson. Over time, these lessons braid together into traditions that seem symbolic but are grounded in lived adaptation. The idea that we may be the seventh civilization emerges naturally from this braid, not as a precise count, but as an intuition, a sense that many cycles have already passed, that what feels unprecedented is often a variation on an old theme, that humanity is older and more experienced than our timelines comfortably admit. This intuition does not demand proof to function. It operates as caution, as humility, as a reminder that complexity is fragile and that survival favors those who notice when systems begin to strain. As the narrative deepens, the question quietly shifts again, not how many civilizations came before us, but how many lessons we are willing to hear. Not whether catastrophe will come, but whether awareness will be present when it does. Ancient stories do not promise safety. They promise continuity of meaning. They suggest that even when structures fail, values can persist. Even when cities vanish, orientation can survive. Even when names are forgotten, patterns remain. And so the cycle continues, not as a curse, but as a teacher, each turn refining perception, each collapse thinning illusion, each renewal offering another chance to listen more closely than before. In this light, being part of a later civilization is not a disadvantage. It is an opportunity. We inherit not only the achievements of those before us, but their mistakes, encoded in story, waiting to be recognized. The night grows quieter around you as this thought settles. Somewhere between past and future, between memory and forgetting, humanity continues its long practice of becoming aware just in time, again and again, learning slowly how to endure without hardening, how to remember without clinging, and how to begin without forgetting what endings have already taught. What endings have already taught is never delivered as a clear instruction. It arrives obliquely, through unease, through repetition, through stories that linger even when their original context has dissolved. This indirectness is not a flaw. It is what allows the lesson to survive translation across time. If ancient cultures had written plainly, saying our civilization collapsed because of this exact behavior, those words would have lost relevance as conditions changed. Instead, they encoded insight into myth, allowing each generation to rediscover meaning according to its own circumstances. The lesson remains alive because it is never fully pinned down. This is why cycles are such a powerful framework. They do not dictate outcomes. They describe tendencies. They show what often happens when certain patterns repeat. Excess leads to fragility. Fragility invites correction. Correction clears space for renewal. The shape remains constant even as the details change. In this framework, the idea of advanced civilizations before ours becomes less about hidden ruins and more about hidden experience. Advancement is not only a matter of tools, it is a matter of awareness. A society can be technologically simple and deeply sophisticated in how it understands limits. Another can be technologically complex and dangerously naive about consequence. Ancient texts often imply that earlier ages possessed a kind of wisdom that later ages lost. This wisdom is rarely defined. It is felt. It manifests as harmony, longevity, clarity. These are experiential qualities, not mechanical ones. Losing them feels like decline even if material conditions improve. If previous civilizations achieved this kind of alignment and then lost it, their memory would persist not as blueprints, but as longing. A sense that something essential once existed and no longer does. This longing is woven through myths of golden ages across the world. It is not necessarily a factual claim. It is an emotional inheritance. Emotional inheritance can be as powerful as factual memory. It shapes aspiration. It shapes fear. It shapes how societies imagine both their origins and their destinies. When people believe they are living in a diminished age, they behave differently. Sometimes they seek restoration. Sometimes they seek escape. Sometimes they accelerate, trying to outrun loss. Acceleration is often misunderstood as progress. Ancient cultures warned against this confusion. They observed that speed can mimic vitality while masking instability. When change accelerates beyond comprehension, coherence fractures. Systems become opaque. People lose the ability to connect cause and effect. This loss of connection is what ancient myths describe as darkness. Not literal absence of light, but absence of understanding. In the Dark Age, people act without seeing the consequences of their actions. They live shorter lives not only because of hardship, but because meaning itself becomes compressed. Seen this way, the Dark Age is not a punishment imposed from outside. It is the internal experience of disconnection. The flood that follows is not only water, it is overwhelm. Too much change, too quickly, washing away structures that cannot adapt. If civilizations before ours reached such a state, their collapse would feel both sudden and inevitable. Sudden to those living through it. Inevitable in retrospect when patterns become visible. And this brings the story gently back to us, not as accusation, but as orientation. To ask whether we are part of a long sequence of civilizations is not to predict our end. It is to invite awareness of pattern, to notice where we might be repeating familiar movements and where we might choose differently. Ancient stories do not insist that cycles must repeat unchanged. They suggest that repetition continues until awareness intervenes. Even then, awareness does not stop change. It shapes how change is experienced. As you rest with this thought, the weight of history begins to feel less oppressive. The past is not pressing down. It is surrounding, offering context, offering companionship. Others have walked through narrowing worlds before. Others have felt the same tension between confidence and unease. They left behind not answers, but signals. And those signals are still here, quiet but persistent, asking not what will happen next, but how attentively we are living now within the turn that is already unfolding. What is already unfolding rarely announces itself as history. It feels like daily life, like routines that slowly change without asking permission, like assumptions that hold until one day they do not. Ancient cultures understood this invisibility of transition, and so they trained themselves to read subtle signs rather than dramatic events. In many traditions, the most important figures are not those who command attention, but those who notice. The watchful one, the listener, the quiet preserver. These figures appear again and again, not as heroes in the modern sense, but as anchors. Their power lies not in strength, but in timing. They sense when to act because they sense when the pattern is shifting. If civilizations before ours rose and fell, they would have depended on such figures, not to prevent collapse, but to soften its edges, to gather what could be saved before the larger structure failed, to translate experience into story before memory fractured completely. This translation is delicate, too literal, and it becomes obsolete, too abstract, and it loses grounding. The ancient solution was myth layered with pattern, a story simple enough to remember, complex enough to unfold meaning over generations. Floods, ages, gods, cycles. These are not explanations. They are containers. Containers allow meaning to survive movement. As people migrate, as languages change, as landscapes transform, the container remains usable. Each generation pours its own experience into it and finds that it still fits. This adaptability is what gives ancient stories their uncanny longevity. When we read them now and feel that they speak to our moment, it is not because they predicted us. It is because they were designed to be reused, to activate whenever conditions resemble those that produced them. This is why the idea of multiple civilizations feels intuitively plausible, even without definitive proof. The stories behave as if they have been through this before. They do not sound surprised by collapse. They sound prepared, familiar, almost patient. Patience is a quality rarely associated with catastrophe, yet it permeates ancient narratives. Time is vast. Loss is expected. Renewal is slow. There is no rush to resolution. The cycle will turn whether individuals panic or not. What matters is how one inhabits the turning. If we are indeed somewhere within a long sequence, then panic is the least useful response. Ancient wisdom does not urge urgency. It urges attention, to land, to relationships, to memory, to scale. These are the things that survive compression. As you sit with this, notice how the question of how many civilizations came before fades further into the background. Numbers matter less than posture, less than whether we are listening, whether we are noticing the same signs others once noticed and tried to encode for us. The past does not accuse. It does not demand belief. It offers pattern. It says, this has happened before, not in detail, but in shape. And shapes are often more instructive than facts. In this quiet realization, something loosens. The future no longer feels like a verdict waiting to fall. It feels like terrain, uneven, uncertain, but navigable. Others have crossed similar ground, carrying less than we do now, yet managing to continue. They left behind not roads, but traces, not instructions, but orientation. And here we are once again at a moment that will someday be remembered not for its clarity, but for how it felt to live inside it, unaware of which details would endure and which would quietly dissolve into story. Unaware of which details will endure, people continue to live, to build, to hope, because life does not pause for historical clarity. This may be the most consistent feature across all cycles. From inside an age, nothing feels final. Everything feels provisional, negotiable, still capable of improvement. Ancient cultures understood this paradox. They did not expect individuals to grasp the full arc of time. They expected them to participate honestly in their moment, to tend fields, to raise children, to tell stories, to do the work of continuity even when the outcome was uncertain. This is why the memory of catastrophe is often gentle rather than accusatory. The stories do not blame ordinary people. They blame imbalance. They blame forgetting. They blame the slow drift away from attentiveness that no single person chooses, but that entire systems encourage. If civilizations before ours existed, they would have drifted too. Not because they were foolish, but because success makes forgetting easier. When systems work, their fragility becomes invisible. The very stability that allows complexity to grow also hides the conditions that sustain it. Ancient myths speak of this hiding as illusion, maya, veil, sleep. Humanity is described as forgetting its origin, its limits, its relationship with larger forces. Awakening comes through disruption, not because disruption is kind, but because it removes illusion. The flood strips away excess, fire reduces complexity, darkness resets orientation. These are not punishments, they are processes, harsh, indifferent, but effective. Afterward, the world is smaller, quieter, and easier to read. This readability is what survivors cling to. In a reduced world, cause and effect draw closer together again. Actions matter immediately. Feedback is swift. Life becomes demanding but intelligible. This is the soil from which renewed awareness grows. Over time, as stability returns, awareness fades once more. The world expands beyond immediate comprehension. Systems multiply. Distance grows between action and consequence. Illusion thickens, and the cycle begins its slow turn again. If we are somewhere within this movement now, ancient stories would urge neither despair nor denial. They would urge clarity, to see what is happening without panic, to recognize signs of strain without dramatizing them, to choose care over speed wherever possible. This is not a call to abandon progress. It is a call to remember proportion, to understand that growth without reflection leads to brittleness. That resilience depends on redundancy, humility, and relationship. As you hold this thought, notice how the story has gradually shifted from speculation about the distant past to a meditation on presence. The idea of earlier civilizations has served its purpose. It has widened the frame. It has loosened the grip of uniqueness. It has made space for humility. Now what remains is quieter, a sense that whatever came before, and however many times the world has reshaped itself, the essential task has remained the same: to live attentively within limits, to carry memory without clinging, to build without believing in forever. The cycle does not demand perfection. It does not reward certainty. It invites participation with awareness. And that invitation, extended across deep time, is still open, waiting patiently, as it always has, for those willing to notice where they stand and how gently they might step forward from here. Stepping forward gently is rarely celebrated, yet it may be the most enduring form of intelligence a civilization can possess. Ancient cultures did not glorify caution because it was timid. They valued it because it preserved continuity. In a world shaped by cycles, survival belongs to those who know when not to push. This wisdom often appears in stories as restraint taught through loss, a flood that arrives after excess, a fire that follows arrogance, a darkness that descends when noise overwhelms listening. These are not moral judgments imposed from above. They are descriptions of thresholds crossed, of balances tipped too far to recover without correction. If civilizations before ours reached such thresholds, their stories would naturally emphasize humility over triumph. They would remember not the peak of their power, but the moment they realized power was fragile. That realization becomes sacred because it is expensive. It is purchased with collapse, with migration, with the slow rebuilding of trust between people and the world they depend on. After catastrophe, the future feels narrow. Choices shrink. Risk becomes personal again. In such conditions, innovation does not disappear, but it changes character. It becomes quieter, more cautious, focused on reliability rather than expansion. These are the phases that rarely impress later historians, yet they are the phases that make survival possible. Over generations, as memory of collapse fades, ambition returns. The world opens again. Distance grows between action and consequence. The same tensions that once led to correction begin to reappear, slowly, subtly. This recurrence is not a failure of learning. It is a feature of being human within time. Ancient traditions did not expect perfect memory. They expected repetition. This is why cycles are described as inevitable, but not meaningless. Each turn offers the possibility of slightly deeper awareness, not enough to escape the pattern, but enough to soften its edges. The idea that we may be one civilization among many fits naturally here, not as a claim of lost glory, but as recognition of accumulated experience. Humanity has been shaped by many endings. Even if we cannot name them, we carry their imprint in our instincts, our fears, our longings for balance. This imprint expresses itself as intuition, a sense that something is strained, a feeling that speed has outpaced wisdom, a quiet unease beneath confidence. These sensations are not new. They have accompanied other civilizations at similar points in the cycle. Ancient stories did not offer solutions to this unease. They offered context. They said, "You are not the first to feel this." Others felt it too. Some listened, some did not. The difference mattered, but not always in the ways they expected. As you rest with this, notice how the narrative resists urgency. There is no countdown, no prophecy, only pattern. The future remains open, shaped by countless small choices rather than a single dramatic moment. The cycle continues not because catastrophe must happen, but because change is constant. What varies is how change is met, with awareness or denial, with humility or hubris, with care or haste. In this sense, the ancient wisdom hidden in myths of lost ages and repeated civilizations is not about predicting collapse. It is about teaching posture, how to stand within uncertainty without hardening, how to move forward without forgetting what instability has already taught. And perhaps this is the quiet inheritance of all those who came before. Not a warning carved in stone, but a way of seeing, passed down through stories, waiting patiently for each new age to recognize itself somewhere within the turning, and to decide, gently, how it will carry the world it has been given. How the world is carried is rarely visible in moments of comfort. It becomes visible when weight increases, when margins thin, when choices begin to matter more than intentions. Ancient cultures understood that the true test of a civilization is not how it rises, but how it responds when rising is no longer effortless. This is why so many ancient narratives linger on moments just before catastrophe. Not on the disaster itself, but on the atmosphere preceding it. The sense of noise, the sense of crowding, the sense that systems once trusted are stretched too tightly to absorb shock. These moments are remembered because they feel strangely familiar, even when the details differ. If civilizations before ours reached similar thresholds, they would have felt this same tension, a feeling of being carried forward by momentum rather than choice, of living inside structures too large to fully understand, yet too fragile to ignore. From within, this feels like inevitability. From a distance, it looks like pattern. Ancient storytellers did not try to interrupt this momentum with commands. They did not say stop. They said remember. Remember that balance is not self-sustaining. Remember that growth demands cost. Remember that what expands too quickly often collapses unevenly. In flood stories, this remembering is embodied in the figure who prepares quietly, not loudly, not convincingly. Quiet preparation is not rewarded in the moment. It is mocked. It is ignored. But it endures. And endurance is what matters when the hinge finally turns. This endurance is not about saving everything. It is about saving enough. Enough knowledge to rebuild. Enough relationship to cooperate. Enough humility to accept that the next world will not resemble the last. Ancient cultures seem to accept this with a calm that feels foreign to modern sensibilities. After catastrophe, the question is not why did this happen? That question fades quickly under the pressure of survival. The real question becomes what still works, what still holds, what still connects people to one another and to the land they now inhabit. This pragmatic focus is why post-catastrophe worlds often appear simpler. Complexity is not rejected out of principle. It is shed out of necessity. What remains is what proved resilient. Over time, complexity grows again, but it grows from a different foundation, shaped by the memory of loss. If we imagine this process repeating multiple times across deep time, the idea of sequential civilizations no longer feels dramatic. It feels organic, a series of attempts, each shaped by the residues of the last, each learning something, each forgetting something else. This layered inheritance may be why ancient myths feel simultaneously distant and intimate. They speak of gods and ages and floods, yet the emotions they evoke are familiar. Fear of loss, hope for renewal, acceptance of limits. These are not archaic feelings. They are perennial. As this block of the story settles, the narrative reaches a quiet plateau. The catastrophe has been described. The reset has been imagined. What remains now is interpretation. How to understand these cycles without reducing them to either literal history or empty symbolism. The next turn will not rush to answers. It will sit with ambiguity. It will explore how modern minds try to read ancient patterns, and what happens when we project our own anxieties backward into stories that were never meant to be precise maps. For now, let the image rest. A world narrowing. A few people preparing quietly. Water rising or systems failing or land shifting beneath familiar feet. And then, after the noise, a silence that is not empty, but waiting. Waiting is often mistaken for emptiness, but in ancient thought, waiting was a phase rich with potential. It was the space between collapse and interpretation, between what had been lived and what could finally be understood. Only after distance grows does meaning begin to settle. This is where interpretation enters the cycle. Not immediately, not cleanly, but gradually, as survivors look back and attempt to explain what happened using the language available to them. Memory reshapes experience. Fear softens. Trauma becomes narrative. What was once chaos acquires form. Ancient cultures did not interpret catastrophe as random. Randomness was intolerable. Meaning had to be found, not to satisfy curiosity, but to restore orientation. Without meaning, the next generation would have no guidance, so causes were named. Excess, noise, imbalance, forgetting. These explanations were not scientific, but they were functional. They offered direction. Over time, interpretation layered itself onto interpretation. A flood became divine judgment. Divine judgment became moral lesson. Moral lesson became cosmology. Each layer preserved something true, even as details drifted. This process did not distort reality. It translated it into survivable form. Modern minds often struggle with this. We want to separate myth from history, symbol from event. But ancient narratives were never meant to be dissected that way. They are hybrid forms, carrying memory, warning, and identity simultaneously. When we ask whether earlier civilizations truly existed, we are engaging in interpretation of interpretation. We are standing several layers removed from the original experience, trying to reconstruct what might have generated such persistent patterns. Some scholars approach this by stripping myth down to geology, climate data, and archaeology. Others approach it by expanding myth outward into cosmic cycles, astronomical events, and deep time. Both approaches reveal something. Neither is complete. The danger lies in choosing one and dismissing the other. If we reduce ancient stories to mere fantasy, we lose their experiential wisdom. If we treat them as literal history, we risk projecting certainty where ambiguity was always intended. The cyclical worldview offers a middle path. It allows myth to be memory without demanding precision. It allows catastrophe to be real without requiring uniformity. It allows civilizations to rise and fall without insisting on exact counts or dates. Seen this way, the idea that we are the seventh civilization is not a numerical claim. It is an interpretive gesture, a way of saying we are not the first to stand here, and we will not be the last. The number becomes symbolic, marking completeness, repetition, and return. Ancient cultures used numbers this way constantly. 7 days, 7 heavens, 7 sages. These were not measurements. They were frameworks. They helped the mind hold complexity without drowning in detail. When modern thinkers revisit ancient records and notice these patterns, the temptation is to decode them like encrypted messages. But perhaps they were never meant to be decoded. Perhaps they were meant to be inhabited. To inhabit a cycle is to accept uncertainty without paralysis, to understand that some truths cannot be pinned down, only approached, to recognize that meaning deepens with patience, not conquest. As this interpretive layer settles, the story does not narrow, it opens. The ancient past stops being a puzzle to solve and becomes a conversation to enter, a conversation about time, memory, loss, and continuity that has been unfolding for as long as humans have been telling stories. And in that conversation, the question shifts once again. Not did this happen exactly as described, but why do we keep telling it? Why does this pattern continue to return, quietly insisting on relevance, no matter how many centuries pass between one telling and the next? Why the pattern continues to return is a question that lives deeper than curiosity. It touches something instinctive, something that recognizes itself in the repetition. Stories survive not because they are accurate in every detail, but because they remain useful. They continue to describe something essential about being human inside time. When ancient peoples told stories of ages before this one, they were not only speaking to the past, they were speaking to the future. To listeners who would find themselves in moments of tension and wonder if others had felt the same. The answer embedded in the story is always yes. This is why cyclical myths endure across cultures that never met. Not because they shared information, but because they shared conditions. Finite land, unpredictable climate, social systems that grow complex and then strain. The human mind responds to these conditions in similar ways, searching for patterns large enough to hold anxiety without breaking. In this sense, the cycle is not imposed on history. It emerges from it. Whenever people live long enough in one place, they begin to notice repetition. Wet years follow dry ones. Abundance leads to waste. Stability breeds complacency. Collapse clears space for renewal. These observations do not require advanced theory. They require attention. Ancient storytellers transformed attention into myth because myth is memorable. A list of data fades. A story anchors itself to emotion, fear, loss, hope, gratitude. These emotions bind memory to identity, ensuring it survives long after details are forgotten. If civilizations before ours rose and fell, their most reliable legacy would not be architecture or tools. It would be emotional memory, a sense of fragility, a respect for limits, a longing for balance. These feelings do not fossilize, but they persist, shaping how later cultures imagine both their beginnings and their endings. This persistence may explain why modern discussions of ancient cycles often feel unsettling. They touch nerves that are already sensitive. We recognize the shape even if we resist the implication. The idea that others stood where we stand now challenges the comfort of uniqueness. But uniqueness has never been humanity's greatest strength. Continuity has. The ability to adapt, to learn imperfectly, to carry fragments forward even when clarity is lost. Cyclical stories honor this strength. They remind us that survival does not depend on being first or final, but on being responsive. As modern minds, we are tempted to turn these stories into theories, to argue about timelines, to search for definitive proof of lost civilizations beneath the sea or buried under ice. This search is understandable. It is the language we know, but it may also miss the deeper function of the stories themselves. The stories are not asking to be proven. They are asking to be noticed, to be allowed to shift how time feels, to soften the illusion that history is a straight road leading inevitably to us. When that illusion loosens, something else becomes possible, a different relationship with the present, less urgency to dominate it. More curiosity about how it fits into a longer arc. This is where the narrative begins to turn inward. The ancient past has done its work. It has widened the frame. Now the cycle asks to be recognized not as an abstract pattern, but as a living one, unfolding quietly around us, not demanding belief, only awareness. And awareness, once awakened, changes how even the simplest moments are felt. Awareness changes the simplest moments by placing them inside a wider silence. What once felt ordinary begins to feel provisional, not fragile in a fearful way, but temporary in a meaningful one. Ancient cultures cultivated this feeling deliberately, knowing that reverence grows not from certainty, but from perspective. When time is felt as cyclical, the present is no longer an end point. It is a crossing, a brief alignment of conditions that will never occur in exactly the same way again. This awareness does not diminish daily life, it deepens it. Every act becomes both ordinary and consequential, part of a flow larger than intention. This is why ancient civilizations invested so much care in ritual. Ritual was not superstition. It was a way of slowing perception, of aligning attention with long rhythms rather than immediate demands. Through repetition, ritual trained the mind to notice change without panic, to expect transition without despair. If civilizations before ours existed and dissolved, they would have relied on such practices to maintain coherence as long as possible. Not because ritual prevents collapse, but because it prepares people for change. It creates shared language for loss, shared language for renewal. Modern societies often dismiss ritual as obsolete, yet we unconsciously create new ones. Daily routines, annual cycles of consumption, repeated narratives of progress and crisis. These, too, shape how time is felt. The question is whether they cultivate awareness or distraction. Ancient stories suggest that distraction is the greater danger, not ignorance, but forgetting to pay attention. When attention fragments, when speed replaces reflection, when novelty drowns continuity, the cycle accelerates. Change arrives before meaning can catch up. This acceleration is not new. Other civilizations experienced it in their own forms. Increased trade, expanding cities, growing administrative complexity. Each advance brought opportunity and strain. Each solution introduced new problems. Over time, the web became too tight to flex. When that happens, collapse feels shocking only because awareness lagged behind momentum. In hindsight, signs were everywhere. Soil degradation, social inequality, overextension. But from within, these appeared as isolated issues, not symptoms of a larger pattern. Ancient cyclical thinking sought to counter this blindness. By framing time as a wheel, it reminded people to look for repetition rather than novelty, to ask not what is new, but what is familiar in a deeper sense, what feels like something that has happened before. This habit of recognition is subtle. It does not produce dramatic insight. It produces orientation, a sense of where one stands relative to larger forces. It is the difference between being swept away by change and moving within it. As this awareness settles, the idea of previous civilizations becomes less about the past and more about the present. It is no longer a question of archaeology alone. It is a mirror held up to how we interpret our own moment. Are we listening? Are we noticing? Are we assuming permanence where there is none? Ancient stories do not answer these questions for us. They ask them again, quietly, knowing that each age must respond in its own way. The cycle does not judge. It simply turns. And in that turning, awareness becomes the only true continuity, the thread that can pass from one age to the next, even when everything else changes shape. When everything else changes shape, awareness is what allows continuity to feel like continuity rather than loss. Ancient cultures understood that forms are temporary, but perception can be trained. This training was not intellectual. It was embodied, woven into daily life through story, rhythm, and repetition. To live cyclically is to expect transformation without needing to dramatize it. It is to understand that what is built will one day be unbuilt, and that this does not negate its value. A house shelters while it stands. A city organizes life while it functions. A civilization carries meaning while it endures. None of these require eternity to matter. This understanding is deeply calming, which may be why ancient stories were often told in measured tones, without urgency. They were not alarms. They were lullabies for a restless species, reminding listeners that time is vast, that change is normal, and that panic is rarely useful. If civilizations before ours existed, they would have told similar stories near the ends of their cycles, not to announce collapse, but to help people feel less alone inside it, to soften fear with familiarity, to say this has happened before, and something endured. Endurance in this sense does not mean preservation of structure. It means preservation of orientation, the ability to recognize balance when it appears, the humility to adapt when it fades, the patience to begin again without pretending nothing was lost. This patience is difficult in times of abundance. When resources are plentiful and systems appear stable, the need for orientation feels abstract. Stories of past collapse sound distant, symbolic, or exaggerated. Only later do they regain their gravity. Ancient cultures anticipated this forgetting. They embedded reminders in cycles that could not be ignored. Seasonal festivals, commemorations of destruction and renewal. Myths repeated until their familiarity itself became instruction. The message was not always understood, but it was always present. Modern societies, too, are surrounded by cycles, though we rarely acknowledge them as such. Economic booms and busts, political rises and falls, environmental feedback loops. These patterns are often treated as problems to be solved rather than rhythms to be understood. Ancient cyclical thinking does not oppose problem solving. It contextualizes it. It says solutions are temporary. Conditions change. What works now may not work later. Wisdom lies not in perfect answers, but in adaptive awareness. As you let this settle, the story reaches a quieter depth. The speculation about lost civilizations has done its work. It has loosened the idea of linear progress. It has made room for humility. Now it invites a more intimate question. How does it feel to live knowing that this too will pass? Not as a threat, but as a fact. Does it make life feel smaller, or does it make it more precious? Does it encourage grasping, or does it invite care? Ancient stories suggest the latter. They imply that impermanence sharpens value, that knowing an age will end encourages gentleness, that awareness of cycles can foster gratitude rather than fear. And perhaps this is the quiet wisdom hidden beneath myths of ancient floods and forgotten civilizations. Not a warning of doom, but an invitation to inhabit time differently, to stand inside the turning without needing to stop it, to live fully within an age, while knowing it is one among many. The cycle continues, not as an enemy, but as a companion, asking only that we notice its movement and choose, within that movement, how attentively we will live. How attentively we live is shaped less by what we know than by how we relate to uncertainty. Ancient cultures did not attempt to eliminate uncertainty. They treated it as a permanent feature of existence, something to be respected rather than conquered. This respect is visible in how ancient narratives leave space for silence. They do not explain everything. They do not resolve every mystery. They allow ambiguity to remain, trusting that meaning does not require full disclosure. In a cyclical world, clarity arrives in waves, not all at once. If civilizations before ours existed, their stories would carry this same restraint. They would avoid precision, not because they lacked intelligence, but because they understood its limits. To define too tightly is to invite disappointment when reality shifts. To leave space is to allow adaptation. Modern thinking often equates knowledge with control. The ancient approach was different. Knowledge was orientation. It helped one stand in relation to forces beyond mastery. It did not promise safety. It promised coherence. This difference matters. A society oriented toward control resists change until resistance becomes collapse. A society oriented toward coherence bends earlier, adjusts gradually, and survives longer. Ancient cyclical stories favor the latter not because it is easy, but because it works. When ancient texts speak of ages ending, they rarely describe resistance. They describe acceptance followed by renewal. The world does not need to be saved from change. It needs to be understood within it. This acceptance is often misunderstood as fatalism, but fatalism implies passivity. Ancient cyclical wisdom is active. It demands attention, restraint, and humility. It asks people to participate wisely in what cannot be stopped. If earlier civilizations practiced this wisdom and still collapsed, their collapse would not be meaningless. It would add to the human archive of experience. Each ending would refine understanding. Each rebuilding would incorporate lessons learned under pressure. This refinement may be slow, almost invisible across generations, but it accumulates. Humanity becomes not smarter in a linear sense, but wiser in a cyclical one. Less surprised by loss, less intoxicated by success, more capable of beginning again. As you sit with this thought, notice how the narrative has gradually shifted tone. The fear of catastrophe has softened into familiarity. The idea of repeated civilizations no longer feels threatening. It feels explanatory. The cycle is not an enemy to defeat. It is a condition to inhabit. Ancient cultures knew this. They spoke of time as a wheel, a spiral, a breathing. These images do not imply doom. They imply rhythm. Rhythm allows rest. It allows recovery. It allows return. A straight line allows none of these. It demands constant forward motion, constant justification, constant growth. Eventually, something gives. Perhaps this is why the linear story of history feels increasingly strained. It asks us to believe that everything leads to us, and only forward matters. The ancient story asks something gentler. It asks us to belong to time rather than dominate it. Belonging changes everything. It makes impermanence tolerable. It makes humility rational. It makes care meaningful even when outcomes are uncertain. And so, as the night deepens and your thoughts slow, the idea of lost civilizations dissolves into something quieter, a recognition that humanity has always lived within cycles, always struggled to remember this, and always found ways to continue anyway. The next turn of the story does not bring revelation, it brings reflection. A soft landing into the understanding that whatever age we are in, it is temporary, and that this truth, once accepted, can be a source of calm rather than fear. Calm emerges when impermanence is no longer resisted. Ancient cultures did not seek calm by denying change, but by aligning with it. This alignment did not remove suffering, but it gave suffering a place within a larger movement, preventing it from feeling meaningless. In cyclical thought, meaning is not derived from permanence. It is derived from participation. To take part in an age, to contribute what one can, and to release what cannot be held, is considered enough. This idea stands in quiet contrast to modern expectations of legacy and endurance. Ancient stories rarely ask individuals to save the world. They ask them to live well within it, to act with care, to preserve what is essential, to accept that outcomes extend beyond any single lifespan. This humility is not resignation. It is realism refined by experience. If civilizations before ours existed, their people would have faced the same tension we face now, the desire to matter against the certainty of passing. Cyclical wisdom resolves this tension not by promising immortality, but by redefining significance. What matters is not how long something lasts, but how well it fits its moment. This is why ancient texts often emphasize right measure, enough rather than more, balance rather than expansion, harmony rather than dominance. These values are not moral ornaments. They are survival strategies shaped by repeated encounters with collapse. When balance is lost, stories say, the world responds, not out of anger, but out of necessity. The response may be slow or sudden, gentle or violent, but it is always corrective. Ancient people did not argue with this. They learned to anticipate it. Anticipation does not prevent endings. It prepares the mind to meet them without panic. It allows grief without despair. It allows rebuilding without illusion. This emotional preparedness may be the most enduring inheritance of all. As the narrative moves deeper into reflection, the question of how many civilizations came before us becomes almost irrelevant. Whether the number is 7 or 70 does not change the lesson. What matters is that humanity has learned, forgotten, and relearned how to live within limits many times. Each time the lesson arrives dressed differently. Different gods, different myths, different landscapes. But beneath the surface, the same understanding waits to be recognized. That time is vast, that change is constant, that awareness is precious. If you listen closely, the ancient stories do not sound alarmist. They sound patient, as if they expect to be misunderstood at first and rediscovered later. When conditions make their meaning clearer, they do not rush. They wait. This waiting mirrors the waiting of the land after a flood, of fields resting after harvest, of silence after noise. It is not empty. It is receptive. It allows what has been learned to settle before something new begins. And so the story eases toward its final movement, not toward conclusion, but toward release. The recognition that being part of a long cycle does not diminish the present. It contextualizes it. It gives it room to breathe. In that breathing, calm returns. Not because the future is known, but because the past has taught that uncertainty is survivable, that humanity has been here before, that whatever shape the next turn takes, awareness will once again be the thread that carries meaning forward, quietly, patiently, into whatever comes next. Quiet patience is not the absence of action. It is the choice to act without the illusion of control. Ancient cultures cultivated this patience not because they were passive, but because they understood the limits of foresight. The future could not be commanded, only met. This understanding shaped how they approached endings. An ending was not treated as failure, but as completion, a cycle fulfilled. When something completes, it releases what it carried, so that something else may begin. Grief is natural in this moment, but so is trust. Trust that continuity does not depend on preserving every form, only on preserving enough meaning to begin again. If civilizations before ours reached their completions, their people would have stood in similar thresholds, looking back at what was built, looking forward without clear images, holding both pride and loss. Ancient stories capture this emotional posture with remarkable consistency. There is mourning, but there is also acceptance. There is sorrow, but not despair. Despair belongs to those who believe time has only one direction. Acceptance belongs to those who know it turns. This turning does not excuse harm. Ancient cultures were clear about that. Excess, arrogance, and disregard for balance were named as causes of collapse for a reason. Awareness was meant to inform behavior, not absolve it. Cycles do not remove responsibility. They contextualize it. Responsibility in a cyclical world is subtle. It does not ask individuals to prevent collapse entirely. It asks them to reduce suffering where possible, to prepare rather than deny, to carry forward what will help others rebuild. These are modest goals, but they are realistic. This realism is what gives ancient wisdom its quiet strength. It does not inflate human importance beyond measure. It places humanity inside a living system, subject to forces it cannot dominate, yet capable of learning how to move within them more gracefully. As you rest with this, notice how the narrative has gradually shed urgency. The question of ancient civilizations has softened into a meditation on continuity. The fear of endings has given way to familiarity. The unknown future no longer feels like an abyss, but like a turn in a well-worn path. Ancient stories were designed to produce this feeling, to soothe the anxiety that arises when individuals confront impermanence, to remind them that while forms vanish, participation continues. That each life, each culture, is a moment of expression within a much longer song. This song does not rush. It repeats themes. It varies tempo. It allows silence between movements. Civilizations are its verses, some loud, some brief, some barely remembered, yet all contribute to the rhythm. And now, as the story approaches its final phase, the invitation is simple. Not to decide what is true, but to notice how it feels to stand inside this perspective, to sense time widening, to feel personal concerns grow lighter against a backdrop of deep continuity. In this widening, there is room for rest, room for curiosity without pressure, room for the understanding that whatever came before us, and whatever comes after, the present moment is still real, still meaningful, still worth inhabiting with care. The cycle does not ask for certainty, it asks for presence. Presence is the final skill a cyclical worldview asks us to master, not because it solves uncertainty, but because it allows us to live fully inside it. Ancient cultures return to this again and again, often without naming it directly. They taught presence through slowness, through repetition, through attention to seasons and stars that could not be hurried. To be present in an age is to see it clearly without insisting it last forever. It is to recognize both its beauty and its limits. This balance is difficult. The mind prefers either nostalgia or projection. Presence asks for neither. It asks only that we notice what is here. If civilizations before ours existed, their final wisdom may not have been technical or monumental. It may have been perceptual, an understanding that no structure, however impressive, can replace attentiveness. That when attentiveness fades, collapse becomes likely not because the world is cruel, but because signals are missed. Ancient myths encode this missed signaling as blindness, sleep, or forgetting. These are not insults. They are descriptions of a natural drift away from awareness that accompanies comfort and complexity. When life becomes easier, listening becomes optional. When listening becomes optional, imbalance grows unnoticed. The return to presence often comes through disruption. When familiar systems fail, attention snaps back to the immediate, the ground, the body, the people nearby. This return is painful, but it is also clarifying. Many ancient traditions treat catastrophe as a forced awakening, harsh but effective. Yet presence does not require catastrophe. This is the quieter lesson woven through cyclical wisdom. Attention can be cultivated deliberately. Slowness can be chosen. Limits can be honored before they are enforced. Ancient rituals, taboos, and seasonal pauses were all attempts to maintain presence during times of abundance. Modern life makes this more challenging, but not impossible. The challenge is not technology itself, but speed. When change accelerates faster than meaning can stabilize, presence erodes. Ancient stories warn against this erosion, not with prohibition, but with pattern. They say this has happened before. Notice what followed. As the narrative approaches its close, the idea of multiple civilizations recedes into the background, having served its purpose. It has widened the frame. It has loosened the grip of linear thinking. Now what remains is simpler and more personal. How does it feel to inhabit this moment with awareness of cycles? Does it make the present feel fragile? Or does it make it feel precious? Does it inspire fear, or does it invite care? Ancient wisdom suggests the latter, but it does not demand agreement. It leaves space for each listener to feel their own response. This spaciousness is intentional. Cyclical thinking does not impose conclusions. It creates conditions for reflection. It trusts that meaning emerges when pressure is released, when the mind is allowed to rest inside a larger context. And so, gently, the story prepares to release its hold, not with answers, but with orientation, not with certainty, but with calm curiosity. The understanding that humanity's story is long, repetitive, and unfinished, and that being alive within it is not a problem to solve, but an experience to inhabit. What came before us, whatever its form, has already passed. What comes after will arrive in its own time. Between these movements, there is this moment, brief, ordinary, irreplaceable. Presence is enough here. Enough is a word ancient cultures treated with reverence. It marked the point where striving softened into belonging. In a cyclical understanding of time, knowing when something is enough is a form of wisdom, one that protects both the world and the mind from exhaustion. As civilizations reach the reflective phase of their cycle, attention often turns inward, not toward self-absorption, but toward meaning. Questions shift from how much can be built to what should be carried forward, from how fast can we move to what is worth slowing down for. These are the questions that arise when expansion has revealed its limits. Ancient stories do not dramatize this phase. They speak quietly of elders, of memory keepers, of those who sit slightly apart from the rush of daily life and observe. Their role is not to command, but to remind, to say gently, "This has happened before," to offer perspective without insisting on obedience. If civilizations before ours existed, their final voices may not have been loud. They may have been subtle, embedded in practices rather than proclamations, a ritual that pauses work, a story told at night, a rule that limits growth without fully explaining why. These are not the tools of domination. They are the tools of continuity. Continuity does not mean sameness. Each cycle reshapes humanity in ways that cannot be undone. Knowledge accumulates unevenly. Sensitivities shift. New dangers emerge. Old ones return. What persists is not form, but capacity. The capacity to adapt. The capacity to remember just enough. The capacity to begin again without denying what was lost. This capacity is easy to overlook because it does not announce itself as progress. It appears as resilience, as the ability to endure uncertainty without hardening, as the willingness to let go of what no longer fits rather than defending it at all costs. As the story moves toward its close, the sense of urgency dissolves almost completely. There is no final warning, no dramatic conclusion, only a widening calm. The understanding that whatever the shape of the next turn, humanity will meet it with the same mixture of confusion and care it always has. Ancient cyclical wisdom does not promise safety, it promises familiarity. It says you are not alone in this feeling. Others have felt it. Others have wondered whether they were late in the cycle or early in the next. Others have stood at similar thresholds, carrying their own versions of hope and doubt. And from that shared experience emerges a quiet compassion, not only for the past, but for the present, for the imperfect ways people navigate complexity, for the mistakes repeated not out of malice, but out of forgetting, for the attempts to build meaning in a world that refuses to stand still. In this compassion, the idea of being one civilization among many loses its sharp edges. It becomes a source of gentleness, a reminder that no age is required to be perfect. Each is only required to participate honestly in its moment. The cycle turns. It always has. Within that turning, there is room to breathe, to notice, to care. And that, perhaps, is what all the ancient stories were quietly guiding us toward all along. All along, the guidance has been subtle, never forcing itself into clarity, never demanding belief. Ancient wisdom understood that what endures must be gentle enough to be carried unconsciously, woven into thought rather than imposed upon it. The final movements of the cycle are not marked by revelation, but by release. Release is difficult for civilizations. It is easier to build than to let go, easier to accumulate than to simplify. Yet every cycle teaches the same lesson in different ways. That clinging exhausts systems, that holding too tightly accelerates fracture. That survival often depends on the courage to loosen grip before necessity enforces it. Ancient stories prepared people for this moment by normalizing loss, not celebrating it, but acknowledging it as inevitable. A temple falls, a city empties, a lineage fades. These are not failures of effort. They are completions of form. What mattered was never the permanence of the structure, but what moved through it while it stood. If civilizations before ours existed, they too would have faced this reckoning, not in a single dramatic instant, but gradually, as priorities shifted and certainty thinned. Their final wisdom may not have been recorded in grand texts or monuments, but in attitudes, in how they treated one another as complexity receded, in how they honored the land when exploitation no longer made sense, in how they spoke to children about a world that would be different from the one they inherited. This is the quiet dignity of the closing phase. It is not heroic. It is tender. It recognizes that endings deserve care, not denial. that transitions deserve guidance, not abandonment. The ancient cyclical worldview does not rush through this phase. It lingers here because this is where meaning concentrates. When excess falls away, what remains reveals what was essential all along. Relationship, memory, orientation. These survive when structures do not. As you rest with this, the narrative no longer feels like history or speculation. It feels like a shared human breath, inhaled and exhaled across millennia. A rhythm older than any one culture, yet intimate to each life. The question of how many civilizations came before dissolves completely now. Numbers no longer matter. What matters is recognition. Recognition that humanity has always lived inside cycles. Recognition that each age believes itself exceptional until reflection arrives. Recognition that endings, when met with awareness, can be gentle rather than violent. This recognition does not eliminate grief. It contextualizes it. It allows sorrow to exist without swallowing everything else. It allows hope to exist without fantasy. It allows the present to be lived fully, without pretending it must last forever. And so the cycle turns one final time in this story, not toward conclusion, but toward quiet continuity. The sense that even as forms pass, something steady remains. Not knowledge in the strict sense, not certainty, but a way of relating to time that has carried humanity through countless changes already. The night grows deeper. Thoughts slow. The story does not end. It simply loosens its hold, trusting that what needed to be felt has been felt, and that whatever comes next will arrive in its own time, as it always has. What arrives in its own time rarely announces itself as arrival. It feels like continuation, like morning after night, like breath following breath. Ancient cultures understood this intimately, which is why their stories do not end with finality. They taper, they soften, they leave space. In a cyclical understanding, the final phase is not an ending, but a return to quiet awareness. After speculation, after catastrophe, after rebuilding and forgetting, there comes a moment of stillness, a recognition that the cycle itself is the constant, not any particular form within it. This recognition brings a strange comfort. If humanity has moved through countless turns already, then uncertainty is not a flaw in the story. It is the story. Each generation inherits not answers, but orientation, a sense of how to stand when clarity is limited, a sense of how to live when permanence is unavailable. Ancient voices seem to speak most clearly here, at the threshold between memory and release. They do not urge preparation for specific events. They urge cultivation of inner posture, patience, humility, attention. These qualities are portable. They survive migration, collapse, and renewal. They require no infrastructure. If civilizations before ours existed, then this posture may be their truest legacy. Not stone, not machines, not forgotten maps, but an attitude toward time that accepts change without surrendering meaning, an understanding that continuity lives in how people respond, not in what they preserve intact. This understanding reframes responsibility. We are not tasked with saving history from ending. We are tasked with carrying it forward honestly, in whatever form the moment allows. That may mean building. It may mean simplifying. It may mean remembering. It may mean letting go. Ancient cyclical wisdom treats all of these as valid, depending on the phase. There is no single correct response, only appropriate ones. Wisdom lies in sensing, which is required now. As you sit with this near completion, notice how the tension that once accompanied the idea of lost civilizations has dissolved. What remains is a gentle continuity, a feeling that humanity's story is not brittle. It bends, it reforms, it survives not because it avoids change, but because it absorbs it. The night continues to deepen, and with it comes a natural slowing. Thoughts become less sharp, less insistent. The mind no longer needs to resolve the question of what came before. It is enough to know that something did, and that its passing did not end the human story. Each life, each culture, each age is a brief expression of something far older. The cycle carries them all, without preference, without judgment. It allows them to rise, to fade, and to make room for what follows. In this perspective, there is nothing to fear in not knowing what comes next. The future does not require certainty to arrive. It requires only that awareness be present when it does. And so the story exhales, preparing for its final quiet movement, where reflection gives way to rest and understanding settles not as conclusion, but as calm acceptance of the long-turning continuity we have always been part of. Calm acceptance is not the end of thought. It is the place where thought no longer needs to push. Ancient cultures understood this as rest, not sleep, but a gentle easing of effort. A moment when the mind releases its grip on explanation and allows understanding to exist without words. In this resting awareness, the long story of cycles no longer feels heavy. It feels spacious. The idea of civilizations rising and falling, of worlds resetting and beginning again, becomes part of a wider rhythm that does not demand resolution. It simply is. What came before us no longer asks to be proven. What comes after no longer needs to be predicted. Between those two vast unknowns lies a narrow, luminous span where life happens, where breath moves in and out, where days begin and end, where meaning is made not by duration, but by presence. Ancient wisdom gently guides us here. It says you are allowed to rest inside the not knowing. You are allowed to release the burden of being first, last, or final. You are allowed to be one moment in a long unfolding without having to justify your place in it. If humanity has lived through many cycles before this one, then rest itself is part of survival. The ability to pause, to reflect, to soften, to let the world be larger than your concerns. This is not escape. It is alignment. Alignment with time as it truly is. Not a straight road, not a countdown, but a turning, a breathing, an endless sequence of beginnings that grow, strain, dissolve, and return in new forms, each cycle carrying forward something intangible, yet essential. That something is not knowledge alone. It is a way of relating to impermanence, to loss, to renewal, to one another. It is the quiet confidence that even when structures fall and stories fracture, meaning can be reassembled in simpler shapes. As the story releases you now, there is nothing left to solve, only something to feel, a sense of continuity that does not depend on certainty, a calm curiosity about where this moment sits within the turning, a gentleness toward both past and future. The night holds this understanding easily. It does not rush it. It does not demand more. It simply allows it to be carried, the way ancient stories were carried from one listening mind to another across time, without urgency. And so the cycle continues, as it always has, quietly, patiently, with room for forgetting and remembering, for loss and return, for endings that are also beginnings. You are here now, within it. That is enough.